$50. The voice cracked through the crowd like a whip. Harlan Greer stepped forward on the platform's edge, his boots thudding hard against the wood as he grabbed Elena Ashford's chin with two thick fingers and wrenched her face toward the crowd. Look at her, strong back, young. She'll work 10 years before she breaks down. He laughed, a sound like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. I'd say that's worth 50, maybe 60 if she doesn't cry. Elena did not cry. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, while the crowd below shuffled and murmured and men called out numbers like she was a saddle horse. They were sizing up for the trail. She was 18 years old, and she was being sold. If this story moved something in you, drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay until the very end. Because what happens next, with a silent rancher and two children who hadn't smiled in years, you will not see coming. The auction had been advertised in the territorial paper 3 weeks running, indentured labor contracts available for settlement of debt. Several individuals, ages 16 to 40, fit for domestic service or ranch work. Bidding opened Saturday. Elena had read the notice herself, folded the paper carefully along its crease, and placed it back on the kitchen table where her father had left it. She had not asked him about it. She already knew. Thomas Ashford had been a man of grand plans and small follow-through for as long as Elena could remember. He had borrowed against their land to buy cattle that died in the drought of 1881. He had borrowed again to replant crops that the following winter destroyed. By the spring of 1882, there was nothing left to borrow against except his daughter, and even that, Elena suspected, he had not fully understood until the debt collector arrived with the contract papers already drawn up. He hadn't looked at her when he signed. She had watched his hand move across the page and thought, this is what it feels like to disappear while still standing in the same room. The morning of the auction, she dressed in her best work clothes, a dark blue dress that had been her mother's, taken in twice to fit her narrower frame, and she braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, down her back, tight and smooth. If she was going to be sold in front of half the territory, she was not going to look like she had given up. The auction block itself was a raised wooden platform at the edge of Dunmore's main street, built for exactly this purpose and used perhaps twice a year when drought or debt drove families past the point of any other solution. Elena had heard about these events her whole childhood, the way children hear about bad weather, as something that happened to other people, somewhere further away. She climbed the steps without being asked. Harlan Greer had been the auctioneer for the past several years, and he ran the process with the same cheerful brutality he might apply to selling off livestock. He was a large man with a red face and a voice built to carry over crowd noise, and he had looked at Elena once when she stepped up, decided she was worth his best showmanship, and grabbed her chin. That was when she understood, completely, all at once, with no room left for denial, exactly what she had become. The crowd below was mostly men, ranchers, farm owners, a few merchants in better coats standing at the back edges. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Most did not look at her face at all, which in its own way was worse than Greer's handling, because at least Greer's cruelty was honest about what it was. 70, called a voice from the left side of the crowd. Elena tracked it without moving her head. Orville Dunst. She knew him by reputation. Everyone in 3 counties did. He ran the Dunst spread south of town, 3,000 acres of dry grazing land that he worked through a rotation of contracted labor that tended to leave people thinner than when they arrived. Stories circulated about the working conditions on that ranch, the way stories circulate in small communities. Quietly, with the names changed, passed between women at the dry goods store. 70 from Mr. Dunst, Greer announced, beaming. Do I hear 80? Elena kept her eyes fixed on the far end of the street, where 2 cottonwood trees grew close together and their branches had started to tangle. She focused on the place where the branches crossed. 80, said Dunst, raising his own bid, either impatient or making a point. Greer laughed. Now don't go bidding against yourself, Orville. Give someone else a chance. A few men chuckled. Elena did not look at any of them. Dunst stepped forward through the crowd, not pushing but moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who expected to be given room. He was perhaps 55, with a broad face weathered to the texture of old leather and small, pale eyes that moved over Elena with purely transactional attention. He said loud enough for the people around him to hear, "She's young. That means she's got years of use in her before she wears out. That's worth paying for." Several men nodded like this was reasonable. Something cold settled in Elena's stomach and did not move. 80 is the standing bid, Greer announced. Does anyone want to give this young lady a better option? There was a pause. Then, from the far back edge of the crowd, a voice said, 120. The number landed differently than the others. There was something in its flatness, no excitement, no performance, that made people turn to look. The man standing at the back was not particularly impressive at first glance. He was tall, but the kind of tall that didn't demand attention so much as simply exist. He wore a heavy canvas work coat, trail-worn but not dirty, and he had the look of someone who had ridden a long distance recently and was still in the process of deciding if the trip had been worth it. His face was somewhere between 35 and 40, angular and serious, with dark eyes that were currently moving over the crowd with what appeared to be mild distaste. Harlan Greer recovered quickly. 120 from... He squinted. Silas Mercer. The name caused its own small ripple. Several people near Dunst exchanged glances. Dunst turned to look at the man. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the eyes. Mercer, he said, nodding, not warmly. Silas Mercer did not nod back. He was looking at the platform with the same flat attention he'd turned on everything else since entering the auction grounds. I'll go 130, Dunst said. 150, Mercer said before Greer could even finish announcing the new number. Dunst's jaw moved. 165. 200. The crowd went genuinely quiet. Not the performative quiet of people waiting for what comes next, but the real kind, sound. The sound of people recalculating. $200 was not an outrageous sum for a man of Mercer's apparent means. Elena had heard enough about the Mercer spread to know it was one of the larger cattle operations in the Northern Territory. But the number was still significant, still beyond what this particular transaction would normally justify, and everyone present understood that whatever Silas Mercer's reason for being at this auction, it had just become more interesting. Dunst stared at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. $200, Greer announced with genuine appreciation. Going once, going twice. A pause that lasted just long enough to be theatrical. Sold to Silas Mercer. Elena breathed. She hadn't realized she'd stopped. Mercer did not come up to the platform immediately. He went first to the contract table at the side, where a thin man in a clerk's coat was already pulling out the paperwork. Elena watched him sign without expression, hand over the payment, and receive the contract in return. He folded it twice and put it in his coat pocket without reading it first, which told her either he'd done this before or he didn't particularly care about the fine print. Then he walked to the platform steps and waited. Elena walked down to him. He looked at her directly when she reached the bottom step. Not the way Greer had, not the way Dunst had. He looked at her face. It was brief, just a few seconds, and then he turned and started walking toward the hitching post where a dark bay horse was tied. "Can you cook?" he asked, not looking back. Elena followed him. "Yes." "Clean." "Yes." "Hard work doesn't trouble you." It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. He untied the horse, checked the cinch out of habit, and then seemed to remember something. He turned slightly. "There's a wagon around the corner. The drive north is 3 days. You can ride in the back or up front. Doesn't matter to me." Elena considered him. "Is there anything else I should know before I agree to come?" He looked at her then with something that might have been surprise, quickly covered. "You don't have a choice in the matter." "I understand the legal situation," she said. "I'm asking what you think I should know." He was quiet for a moment. A man walked past them leading a mule. The auction noise continued behind them, another person being processed through the same machinery. "There are children," Mercer said finally. "2 of them, 6 years old." "Twins?" "Yes." He paused. "They've run off the last 3 housekeepers. The one before that only lasted 11 days. Elena absorbed this. "What happened to their mother?" "She died." He said it the way people say things they've said many times, not carelessly, but with the particular economy of someone who has learned that elaborating doesn't help. "I'm sorry," Elena said. "The wages are fair. The work is honest. That's what I can offer." He turned back to the horse. "The rest you'll have to figure out for yourself." Elena picked up her bag, one bag, everything she owned, and walked around the corner to find the wagon. His name was Silas Mercer, and he was, Elena decided over the course of the first day's travel, a man made almost entirely of silences. He drove the wagon with the focused economy of someone who had been doing it long enough that it required no conscious thought, leaving his mind free to be somewhere else entirely. He didn't appear unfriendly so much as simply absent in some important way, present in body, attending to the road and the horse and the weather, but the part of a person that normally reaches toward other people had been turned off, or turned inward, or simply stopped working at some point and never been repaired. Elena sat beside him on the wagon seat because the back was loaded with supplies, and it would have been awkward to perch there like cargo. She did not try to make conversation after the first hour, when it became clear that her questions were being answered in the minimum number of syllables technically required for accuracy. "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years. "Do you have any other staff besides ranch hands?" "One cook. She handles the kitchen, but she's getting on in age. You'll take over her duties." "What are the children's names?" He had paused at that one. "Owen and Clara." He'd said nothing more about them. Elena had said nothing more either, but she thought about it. 2 6-year-olds who had driven away 4 housekeepers. She'd grown up partly raising her younger brothers before they were taken to live with an uncle. She was not intimidated by children in theory. In practice, a pair of grieving 6-year-olds with established defensive strategies was a different proposition. On the second day, they stopped to rest the horse at a creek that ran shallow and clear along a flat stretch of land. Elena climbed down and went to splash water on her face, and when she stood up, Mercer was standing a few feet away filling the canteens. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He didn't say no, which she took as permission. "Why were you at the auction?" He screwed the cap onto the first canteen. "I needed help with the children." "You could have hired someone." "I tried." He moved to the second canteen. "People don't stay. Word gets around." "So you thought a contracted laborer would have less choice about leaving?" He looked at her then. It was a longer look than usual. "Yes," he said simply. She respected that. It would have been easy for him to dress it up in better language, to talk about opportunity, or fair wages, or rescue. He hadn't. He had given her the honest reason, and the honest reason was practical, and a little cold, and completely real. "What happened to their mother?" Elena asked. "If you don't mind saying." A pause. He capped the second canteen. "Fever. 3 years ago. Both children were sick at the same time. She nursed them through it." He stopped. "Didn't come through herself." Elena was quiet. "They were 3 years old," he said. "They don't have clear memories of her, just—" He stopped again. "Impressions." "And every woman who's come to the house since has left," Elena said. "Yes. And the children know that." He looked at her again. This time there was something different in it, a sharpness. "What do you mean?" "I mean they know they can run people off," Elena said. "And they probably don't entirely know why they're doing it, but some part of them figures that if they don't let anyone get close, no one can leave them again." Mercer stood very still for a moment. The creek made its small, constant sound. Somewhere upstream, a bird called once and then was quiet. "Maybe," he said finally. He walked back to the wagon. Elena followed. They didn't speak again for the rest of that afternoon, but something had shifted in the silences between them. Not exactly warmth, but a small adjustment, a recalibration. He'd heard her, and she'd felt it. The Mercer Ranch appeared on the third afternoon, coming into view gradually the way large things often do. First as a suggestion on the horizon, a dark cluster of structures against the pale grass, then taking on definition as they drew closer. A main house of solid log construction, a barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse off to the east where the ranch hands would sleep, corrals with horses, a few cattle visible in a far field. It was not a beautiful place in the way that paintings tried to make the frontier beautiful. It was functional and worn and real, and that gave it a different kind of dignity. The dignity of a thing that had been built to work and had worked. Elena had no time to look at it long, because the moment the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, two small figures erupted from the direction of the barn. They were identical enough to be disorienting. The same dark hair, the same brown eyes, the same compact frame. The girl's hair was loose and had twigs in it. The boy had what appeared to be flour on his left sleeve and a look of absolute suspicion directed at Elena from a distance of 20 feet. "Who's that?" he said, directly to his father, not to Elena, as if she couldn't hear him. "New housekeeper," Mercer said, climbing down. "We don't want one," the girl said. She was looking at Elena too, but without the boy's open hostility, more like someone cataloging information. "Clara," Mercer said, with a particular kind of tiredness. "We told you," Owen said. "We don't need one. We're fine. The bread burned 3 times last week. That was an accident. And the week before. It was—" Owen stopped, rallied. "We don't need someone we don't know coming into the house." Elena climbed down from the wagon and picked up her bag. She looked at the 2 children for a moment. Owen was braced for whatever she might do. A lecture, a forced cheerfulness, an attempt to immediately demonstrate what a wonderful, caring person she was. Clara was still watching with that careful, unreadable expression. "I burned bread too," Elena said to Owen. "Twice last month. It's embarrassing." Owen blinked. "The house is yours," Elena said. "I'm not here to change it. I'm here to work. If you decide you want to talk to me at some point, I'll be around." She looked at Mercer. "Could someone show me to the kitchen?" Mercer, and she thought she might have imagined this, but she didn't think she did, looked briefly like he wanted to smile. He pointed toward the house. "Margaret handles the kitchen. She'll show you around." Elena walked toward the house. She didn't look back at the children. Behind her, she heard Owen say, in a low voice to his sister, "She's not like the others." And Clara very quietly, "I know. That's what worries me." "What?" Margaret Holt was somewhere in her late 60s with the posture of someone who had been working hard for all of them and the brisk competence of a woman who had strong opinions about where things belonged and was going to tell you about them once and expected them to stay that way. She showed Elena the kitchen with the efficiency of a general briefing a replacement officer. The pantry inventory, the icebox situation, the stove's particular temperament, the timing of the ranch hand's meals, the children's preferences. "Owen hates parsnips," she said, pulling open a drawer to show Elena the good knives. "He'll eat them if you disguise them, but he'll look at you the whole time like you've committed a crime. Clara eats everything, but she goes through phases where she decides she doesn't like the color of her food, which—" She waved a hand. "You'll see." "How long have you been here?" Elena asked. 7 years? Margaret closed the drawer. "I was here before the missus passed. I stayed after." She paused. "I'm not going anywhere, so don't worry about that. But my hands have gotten bad in the cold. I can supervise, but I can't do the kneading anymore, or anything that takes—" She flexed her right hand and winced. "I can't do much of the physical work anymore." "What happened to the other housekeepers?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. She picked up a cloth and wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. "Owen put a snake in the first one's bed," she said. "He was 4.5. I don't know where he found a snake that small in November." She paused. "The second one, Clara told her Mr. Mercer had a terrible temper and would throw things. He doesn't. He's never raised a hand to anything that wasn't a fence post. But she left before I could correct the story." Another pause. "The third and fourth, I think they just got lonely. It's a long way from town. Not everyone's made for that." Elena thought about this. "And the children, do they know they're running people off on purpose?" Margaret looked at her with something sharp and assessing. "That's a more interesting question than most people ask," she said. Then, "I think Clara knows. I think Owen doesn't let himself know, because if he knew, he'd have to feel bad about it." Elena nodded slowly. "What's your plan?" Margaret asked. Not unkindly, more like a test with genuine curiosity behind it. "I don't have one yet," Elena said honestly. "I think plans are usually the wrong approach with children who already know all the plays." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the stove and put the kettle on. "I'll make us some tea," she said, "and you can tell me about yourself." It was, Elena thought, the closest thing to being welcomed that she'd received since arriving. She pulled out a chair and sat down. The first week was an education in patience. Owen's opening move was silent observation. He watched Elena from doorways, around corners, through windows, cataloging her habits, looking for weaknesses, trying to determine what kind of threat she represented. He never spoke to her directly if he could avoid it, addressing any necessary communication through his sister or occasionally through a sidelong mutter in the general direction of his father. Clara was more direct, which was in some ways harder to navigate. She appeared beside Elena during chores without warning, watched with intense focus, and asked questions that had the surface of innocent curiosity and the structure of interrogation. "Did you have a family before?" Elena was washing the morning dishes. "Yes, a father and 2 brothers." "Where are they now?" "My brothers are with my uncle. My father—" She stopped. "He's in Dunmore still, I think." "Why didn't you stay with them?" "It's complicated." "That means you don't want to explain." Elena looked at her. Clara looked back with those steady, dark eyes that were so much like her father's, it was slightly unnerving. "Yes," Elena said. "It does." Clara seemed to respect this. She picked up a dishcloth and started drying without being asked. That small moment mattered more than it should have. On the 4th day, Owen escalated. Elena came down to the kitchen at 5 in the morning to start breakfast and found that every pot in the kitchen had been moved. Not hidden, just relocated. The large stock pot was on the floor. The frying pans were stacked in the pantry. The small sauce pot was in the butter dish cabinet. It would have taken someone perhaps 20 minutes to accomplish this, which meant Owen had been up by 4:30. Elena stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at the rearrangement. Then she started breakfast using whatever containers were closest to hand. She made it work. It took longer and was more awkward than it should have been, but by the time ranch hands started filing in at 6:30, there was food on the table. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:45, clearly expecting some kind of reaction, outrage, confusion, wounded feelings. He found Elena wiping down the counter with the same efficiency she'd applied to every other morning. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Good morning," she said. He left. By 8 o'clock, the pots were back where they belonged. He hadn't done it in front of her. She hadn't commented on it. But when she pulled open the drawer for a spoon at mid-morning and found the spoons arranged in a pattern she didn't recognize, she left them exactly as they were. It was on the 6th day that Elena was braiding her own hair in the small mirror of her room when the door opened without a knock and Clara appeared in it. She stopped when she saw what Elena was doing. "Your hair is really long," Clara said. "My mother had hair like this," Elena said. "I keep it long because of her." Clara came into the room without being invited. She stood behind Elena and watched in the mirror. "My hair gets tangled," she said. It came out with a quality of statement rather than complaint, like she was reporting a fact. "I can see that," Elena said gently. "Margaret does it, but she doesn't know how to get the knots out without it hurting." Elena looked at her in the mirror. "Would you like me to try?" A pause. "Maybe," Claire said. "Go get your brush." She was back in 2 minutes with a tortoiseshell brush that had clearly seen better days. Elena had her sit on the edge of the bed and started at the bottom, working up slowly, the way her mother had done for her. Clara didn't make a sound when the brush caught. After a while, she said, "You're not as bad as I thought." "What were you expecting?" "Someone who would try too hard." A pause. "The last one used to say sweetheart all the time. She didn't mean it." "Some people do that when they're nervous," Elena said. "Were you nervous when you got here?" Elena considered lying. "Yes," she said instead. "You didn't look it." "I was trying not to show it, same as you." Another long pause while Elena worked a stubborn knot free from behind Clara's ear. Clara flinched but didn't pull away. "Owen doesn't hate you," Clara said finally. "He's just scared." "I know. He won't say so." "I know that too." Elena smoothed the section she'd finished. "He doesn't have to." Begin. The breakthrough with Owen came unexpectedly, the way most real things do. It was a Tuesday, 10 days after Elena had arrived. She was attempting to make bread, her third try since the first two had come out flat and dense, which she was quietly furious about, and she had reached the kneading stage when she heard a sound from the corner of the kitchen. Owen was sitting at the far end of the long table, supposedly doing his letters, actually watching her fight with the dough. "You're doing it wrong," he said. Elena looked at him. "Am I?" "You're pushing it too hard." He watched for another moment. "Margaret pushes it lighter but faster. You push it slow and hard and it doesn't work the same." Elena considered this information. Then she said, "Can you show me?" Owen's expression went through several rapid changes. This was not what he had expected. He stopped. "It's just what I've seen." "Show me," Elena said again, and stepped back from the counter. He got up slowly, like he was deciding at each step whether to keep going. He came to the counter, he looked at the dough, he started working it, and she saw immediately what he meant, the lighter touch, the quicker rhythm. "Like this?" she said, taking over. "A bit lighter." She adjusted. "Yeah." He watched. "That's it." They worked in silence for a while. Then Owen said, without looking at her, "She used to make bread on Tuesdays. Our mother." Elena kept her hands moving. "Tuesday bread," she said. "She said it was the best day for bread because there was less happening." He paused. "I don't remember it exactly. His voice changed, went smaller. "I remember the smell." Elena said nothing for a moment. She let the silence hold the weight of what he'd said. Then, very carefully, "I think Tuesday bread might be a tradition worth keeping." Owen didn't answer, but he also didn't leave. He stayed at the counter until the bread was in the oven, showing her twice more where her technique was off, and if neither of them acknowledged what had actually just happened between them, that was fine. Some things in human life don't survive being named too early. They just have to be allowed to exist first. Silas Mercer watched all of this from the particular distance that a man like him maintained from things that made him feel too much. He saw the bread incident from the window, hadn't meant to see it, had been passing through the yard and glanced in through the kitchen glass out of habit, and then found himself standing still while his son stood at the counter next to the woman he'd bought at auction, both of them with flour on their hands, Owen explaining something with a seriousness that the boy normally reserved for problems with horses or fence lines. He stood there for longer than he should have and then made himself move. In the evenings, after supper, Elena would sit with the children and tell them stories. Not the soft, pretty kind, but real stories with danger in them, where people made mistakes and had to find their way back from those mistakes, and where the endings were satisfying not because everything became perfect, but because the people in them had become stronger or wiser or had found each other in the dark. Owen would deny being interested while drifting closer to where she sat. Clara would listen with her knees pulled up and her eyes on the middle distance, processing things at a depth that was slightly uncanny in a 6-year-old. Mercer would sit in the adjacent room and not listen, which is to say, he would sit in the adjacent room and hear everything. He had not expected this. He had expected practical competence. He had expected someone who would manage his household without running from it, which was already more than he'd managed to find in the previous attempts. He had not expected someone who seemed to understand his children, not in the way that people claim to understand children by reading books about children, but in the actual particular way of understanding that happens when one person pays careful, quiet attention to another person. He found it unsettling. He found it something else too, something he didn't have a name for yet and wasn't interested in examining, but it was there the same way the thing under the ice is there before the thaw, present and patient and heavier than it looked. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks in, he came to the kitchen well after supper to find Elena at the table alone with a cup of something hot and a small pile of papers covered in her own handwriting. She looked up when he came in, then back at what she was doing. "Inventory," she said, before he could ask. "I think the feed situation is going to be tight through January if we don't order now. The hay stores are lower than they should be." He stopped. "Margaret usually handles the household inventory." "Margaret's hands are bad. She asked me to take it over." Elena looked up again. I hope that's all right. The feed, he said, coming closer to look at her numbers without quite deciding to do it. Where did you get those figures? Asked Patterson in the barn. He knew the numbers. She tilted the paper slightly toward him. I also thought, if it's not overstepping, that the account with Grover's Supply in town should probably be reviewed. The pricing on the last 3 orders looked high to me. Mercer looked at the paper, then at her. You can read accounts. My father was a disaster with money, Elena said. I had to learn to read the books by the time I was 14, or we were going to starve. I got pretty good at it. He stood there for a moment, in the kind of silence she was learning to read. This one was the thinking kind, not the shutdown kind. Then he said, I'll get you the full accounts tomorrow. She nodded. He started to leave. Then he stopped at the doorway. The children have been... He paused, choosing words with visible care. They seem better. They're doing well, Elena said. Owen made me try his bread this week. Something moved in his voice. It was good. Elena looked down at her papers. He's got good instincts. He gets that from his mother. He said it quietly. Then he said goodnight and left. Elena sat alone in the kitchen for a while after he was gone. The house had settled into its night sounds. Outside, the wind moved across the open ground with that particular loneliness that big empty spaces carry after dark. She thought about Silas Mercer. She thought about a man who had lost something enormous and had learned to survive it by going very still, by reducing himself to function, by being exactly what was needed and nothing more. She thought about how that kind of survival looks like strength from the outside and how it feels like suffocation from the inside. She knew that feeling. She was still learning her way out of it herself. She finished her inventory, put out the kitchen lamp, and went to bed. At the end of the hall, she could hear Owen and Clara breathing in their sleep, Clara's slightly louder, Owen's more even. She had learned already which was which. She lay in the dark and thought, I don't know what this place is yet, but it might be something. It was the first night since arriving that she had fallen asleep without waiting to feel afraid. The bread became a Tuesday ritual, not by announcement, not by any formal decision between them, just by the quiet accumulation of habit that happens when 2 people find something that works and neither of them wants to be the one to break it. Owen would appear in the kitchen around mid-morning, still pretending it was coincidence, still pretending he had some other reason to be standing near the counter on a Tuesday. Elena would already have the flour out. She would not comment on his arrival. He would not explain it. They would work, and the bread would come out better each week. And neither of them spoke about why Tuesdays specifically, because they both knew, and knowing was enough. Clara's transformation was quieter, but in some ways went deeper. She had started leaving small things outside Elena's door. A smooth stone she'd found by the creek, a hawk feather, once a folded piece of paper with a drawing on it that took Elena a moment to recognize as the 2 cottonwood trees at the end of Dunmore's main street. Elena had no idea how Clara knew about those trees. She kept everything. She placed them on the windowsill of her room without comment, and when Clara finally noticed them there one afternoon, she went so still for a moment that Elena had to look away to give her the privacy of the feeling. The ranch, meanwhile, was teaching Elena things about herself that she hadn't had occasion to learn before. She had known she could work. She had worked hard her whole life, keeping house for a father who couldn't be counted on, raising 2 brothers who needed more than she had, managing a household on a budget that required constant mental arithmetic just to keep food on the table. She had thought she knew what hard work meant. The Mercer Ranch expanded that definition considerably. The days started before light, not the gentle kind of not quite dark that happens in the hour before sunrise, but actual dark, full dark, cold dark, that hit the face when she stepped out to help with the morning chores and made her eyes water. By the time the sun came up, she had already fed the kitchen fire, started water for coffee, checked on the supply stores, and begun whatever the morning meal required. By the time breakfast was on the table for the ranch hands, she had been awake for 3 hours. The ranch hands themselves were a particular education. There were 6 of them. Patterson, who ran the barn with the particular authority of a man who had been doing it longer than anyone else, and had opinions about every aspect of it. A young hand named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 19 and seemed to exist in a permanent state of trying to prove something. 2 brothers named Hatch, and Lester, who communicated primarily through a shared shorthand of half-finished sentences and significant looks, and two older men, Darnell and Vic, who had worked the ranch for years and regarded Elena's arrival with the cautious assessment of men who had seen housekeepers come and go and had learned not to invest too quickly. None of them were unkind to her, but none of them were particularly easy either, in the way that a group of men with established habits and routines are never particularly easy with someone new who has to navigate around those habits and routines without disturbing them. Meals needed to be on time. The coffee needed to be right. Patterson took his black and too strong. Cody liked it sweet to the point where it wasn't really coffee anymore. The Hatch brothers didn't drink it at all. She learned these things the way you learn terrain, by crossing it and noting where the rough spots were. What she hadn't expected was that the ranch hands would, in their way, start helping her. It started with Patterson. About 2 weeks in, he appeared at the kitchen door one afternoon while she was wrestling with a crate of supply goods that was significantly heavier than it looked. He didn't say anything. He just picked up the other end of it. Together they got it into the pantry. He left without comment. But after that, whenever there was something that required more hands than she had, Patterson seemed to materialize nearby with the same wordless practicality, and after a while she stopped being surprised by it. Darnell was the one who told her about the fence problem. "Eastline's been down since October," he said one morning, accepting his coffee with the careful manner of a man who chose his words like he chose his tools, for fitness to purpose. "Mercer knows about it, but the east pasture's been empty since the breeding stock moved, so it hasn't been a crisis." "And now?" Elena asked. "Moving the breeding stock back next month." He looked at his cup. "Just thought you might want to know, since you've been going over the accounts." She had been going over the accounts for 2 weeks by that point, and what she had found was not catastrophic, but not comfortable either. The pricing discrepancy she'd noticed with Grover's supply in town was real, 3% higher than comparable suppliers in the territory, consistently over 18 months. Mercer's arrangement with Grover appeared to be long-standing and possibly personal, which made it complicated to address directly. She had noted it in the margin of her ledger copy and left it there while she figured out the right approach. The feed situation she had already fixed, or begun fixing. She'd sent a letter with the supply rider to a dealer in Callaway that Margaret had mentioned, got a better price, arranged the order for January delivery. Mercer had reviewed it without comment, which she was learning meant approval. The fence problem was a different kind of issue. It required labor, and labor cost money, and money in November was tighter than money in spring. She thought about it for 2 days and then raised it over supper. It was the 4 of them at the table, herself, Mercer, Owen, and Clara. Margaret ate earlier in the evenings because her joints troubled her more in the late hours. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse. This particular arrangement, the 4 of them around the kitchen table, the small domestic geography of it, had established itself gradually and without discussion, and Elena was aware that it meant something without being ready to examine exactly what. "The east fence," she said, during a lull in the conversation that Owen was trying to fill by explaining to his father, with some urgency, why his horse needed a new saddle blanket before winter. "I've been thinking about it." Mercer looked at her. "I'm handling it." "I know, I was thinking about the timing." She had the numbers in her head. She didn't need the ledger. "If you pull Hatch and Lester off the north pasture work for 4 days, the east line could be repaired and restretched before the breeding stock moves. But that delays the north pasture work, which means it won't be done before the ground freezes, which means it waits until spring. I know the trade-off," Mercer said. "I wasn't finished." She said it calmly, not as a challenge. "Cody's been trying to prove himself since he arrived. Give him the north pasture repair as a solo project with Vic supervising. It doesn't take 2 strong hands. It takes 1 careful one and some time. Cody gets his chance. Hatch and Lester fix the east line. Both projects get done before the freeze." The table was quiet. Owen was looking at Elena with open interest. Clara was looking at her father. Mercer ate a bite of his supper. He chewed it. He said, "Cody hasn't done solo work before." "Then it's time he did." Another pause. "He might make mistakes." "Vic will catch the important ones." She picked up her fork. "Besides, Cody making small mistakes on a fence line is less costly than the breeding stock getting into the wrong pasture in January." Mercer said nothing more about it that night. The next morning she saw him talking to Cody in the yard. and the morning after that, Cody left for the North Pasture with Vic and a loaded supply mule and the expression of a man who had been handed something he'd been wanting and was now terrified of dropping it. Hatch and Lester started on the east fence on Wednesday. At supper that night, Owen said, very casually, "Elena fixed the fence problem." "I didn't fix it," Elena said. "Your father made the decision." "But you told him how." Owen ate a spoonful of stew. "That's basically the same thing." "It is not the same thing," Mercer said, with a quietness that managed to convey both authority and something that was almost amusement. Owen gave this the response it deserved, which was a small shrug and another spoonful of stew. Clara watched her father's face during this exchange, with the patient intensity she brought to everything, and said nothing. "What?" There was a Thursday in mid-November when Elena understood, fully and without any remaining uncertainty, that the Mercer Ranch had stopped being a place she was contracted to work and had started being something she was going to have to eventually reckon with on different terms. It happened without drama, which was perhaps the point. She was in the barn, not because she had particular business there, but because Owen had asked her to come see something. Would not say what, only that she had to come. And she had learned enough about Owen by then to know that his moments of genuine invitation were rarer than they looked and worth taking seriously. What he showed her was a corner stall in the back of the barn where one of the mares had given birth to a foal 3 days earlier, unexpected by several weeks. The foal was all legs and uncertainty, pressing close to its mother's side with the specific need of something that has only recently discovered how large the world is. Owen stood at the stall gate, with his arms over the top rail and his chin resting on them, watching the foal with the expression he almost never showed anywhere except here, apparently, the one without any performance in it, just a boy and something he found beautiful. "Patterson says she wasn't supposed to foal until January," he said. "Things happen early sometimes," Elena said. "She's going to need extra care." He was quiet for a moment. "I already asked Patterson if I could help, and he said yes. I'm going to come out every morning before school lessons." Elena looked at the foal, then at Owen. "What are you going to name her?" He hadn't looked up. "I was thinking November, because that's when she came." "That's a good name." Clara wanted to name her something fancier. He made a face. "Something French. I don't know where she got that from." "I might have told her a story last week that had a French character in it," Elena admitted. Owen looked at her sideways. "She's been saying French words ever since, random ones, in the middle of sentences." "I'll be more careful," he snorted. Not quite a laugh, but the immediate precursor to one. Then he looked back at the foal. "Elena." He said her name the way children say names when they are building up to something and need the name to be a bridge. "Do you like it here?" She considered giving him the easy answer. She decided against it. "I think I might," she said instead. "I'm still figuring it out." "You're not going to leave," he said. It came out as a statement, but the shape of it was a question. "I don't have plans to leave," Elena said. The others all said that too. He wasn't accusing her. He was just being honest, with the brutal honesty of a child who has been let down enough times to have stopped sugarcoating reality. She thought about it. "I can't promise you the future," she said finally. "I don't think anyone can do that honestly, but I can tell you that right now, I'm here. And right now is what we've got." Owen considered this for a long time. The foal moved, found its footing, pressed against its mother. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, and the cold came through the gaps in the boards with that particular sharpness that belonged to November. "Okay," Owen said. Just that. But she heard what was underneath it, which was a small and very careful act of trust extended by a 6-year-old boy who had very good reasons to be stingy with it. She stayed beside him at the stall gate until the cold became too much, and they went in for supper. Clara found her a week later sitting alone on the back step in the early morning, before the rest of the house was up. Elena had come out for 10 minutes of quiet before the day started, one of the small necessities of living and working in close quarters with people, and was watching the way the frost lay across the grass in the gray pre-dawn light. Clara came and sat beside her without announcing herself, wrapped in a blanket she'd pulled off her bed, dark hair loose and wild with sleep. "You're up early?" Elena said. "I heard you come down." Clara tucked the blanket tighter around herself. I sometimes can't sleep. What do you think about when you can't sleep? Clara considered this seriously. Mostly I think about my mother, she said, which is hard because I don't remember her well enough to think about the real her. I just think about the idea of her. Elena was quiet. Is that strange? Clara asked. No, Elena said. I think about my mother, too. She's been gone 5 years and I still reach for her sometimes, when something's hard, or when something's good and I want to tell someone. Clara looked at her. What was she like? Elena thought about it honestly, the way you think about someone when you're not performing the memory for anyone. Practical, she said. Not very soft. She didn't say I love you very often. She showed it by doing things. She taught me to braid my own hair because she said a woman should be able to do everything for herself first and then choose who she wanted to do it for her. She paused. She was also funny, quietly. You wouldn't always notice it. Clara absorbed this. Papa's like that, she said. The funny part, you don't always notice it. Elena looked at her sideways. I've noticed, she said. Clara smiled, a small, private smile that she quickly tucked back in. But Elena caught it. They sat on the step together until the sky went from gray to pink to the first pale blue of morning, and the frost began to melt at the edges. Then Clara said, I'm cold, and went back inside, and Elena heard her on the stairs, and then the house was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than it had been 5 weeks ago. Something in it had changed, shifted toward warmth, the way a room feels different when someone you care about has just left it rather than when the room was empty to begin with. The first real collision with the outside world happened in the 4th week of November, when Silas drove the wagon into Dunmore for supplies and came back late and quieter than usual, which was notable because his usual was already quiet. Elena noticed it at supper. He ate without contributing to the conversation, which he normally did at least minimally. A question for Owen about the foal, a comment about the weather pattern, something. Tonight there was nothing. The children felt it, she could tell. Owen ate faster than normal. Clara watched her father's face with that careful measuring look and then looked at Elena as if asking a question without words. After the children were in bed, Elena came back to the kitchen to finish the morning's prep and found Mercer sitting at the table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the middle distance. She put water on to heat without asking. She worked quietly at the counter. After a while he said, Orville Dunst was in town today. She turned slightly without stopping what she was doing. He came to speak to me at the supply store, Mercer said, in front of 3 other men. He paused. He made some comments about the auction, about you. Another pause. About the arrangement. Elena kept her hand steady. What kind of comments? The kind that are technically not accusations but land the same way. His voice was flat, controlled. He implied, in front of witnesses, that a man with a different sort of character might have more practical reasons for buying a young woman at auction than household management. The kitchen was very quiet. He implied it about you, Mercer said, and about me, both at once, which I think was the point, to make any defense of you look like a defense of myself, which would confirm the implication. He looked at his cold coffee. He's a careful man that way. Elena turned around. She leaned against the counter and looked at him directly. What did you say? Nothing I'm particularly satisfied with. He pushed the mug away from him. I told him the arrangement was contractual and legal, and that his interest in my household was neither welcomed nor appropriate. Which is true, but it doesn't... He stopped. It doesn't address what he was actually doing, which was establishing a story, in front of witnesses. That can be repeated. Can it hurt you? It can hurt you, he said. More than me. A man has more room than a woman for stories like that to bounce off of. Elena looked at him for a moment. She had known from the beginning that the auction itself, the fact of it, the nature of it, was something she would carry for a long time regardless of how the reality turned out. She had known that other people would construct whatever narrative suited them. She had not expected him to be the one sitting at her kitchen table looking like the story was doing damage to him on her behalf. Dunst wanted me at his ranch, she said. He was outbid, and he didn't like it. This is what that looks like. I know what it is. He looked at her. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I expect you to. He stopped, rearranged. You didn't ask for any of this. Neither did you, Elena said. He was quiet. Mr. Mercer. She said it deliberately, pulling his attention back to her face. Orville Dunst makes money by making other people feel small and then waiting to see if they stay small. I grew up with a father who couldn't manage his own finances and had to watch men like Dunst circle our situation for years, waiting for the moment it collapsed enough for them to move in. She looked at him steadily. I'm not afraid of Orville Dunst's stories. People who know me will see me. People who believe him weren't going to think well of me regardless. A pause. What does worry me is whether it causes problems for the ranch, for you, for the children. Mercer looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Too many things moving behind it at once. He said, That worries you more than your own reputation. My reputation is mine to manage, she said. Your ranch is where 4 people live. Different stakes. He was quiet for a long time. The water on the stove had started to whisper, and she went to take it off the heat. When she turned back, he was still looking at her, and the expression had settled into something simpler. Not resolved, not happy, but something that looked like it might eventually develop into trust if she gave it enough time. I put the word out with Patterson, he said. He'll make sure the hands understand the situation correctly, in case anything reaches them. Thank you, she said. It shouldn't have needed doing. A lot of things shouldn't need doing, Elena said. But here we are. She made him a fresh cup of coffee, hot this time. He took it without comment. He stayed at the table another half hour, and she finished her prep work, and they existed in the same space in the kind of comfortable parallel that takes most people much longer to find, the kind where silence doesn't demand to be filled. When he finally said goodnight and left, she stood at the counter for a moment and recognized the particular feeling of having someone in your corner in a way you hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with yet. December arrived with its own agenda. The temperature dropped fast and serious, the kind of cold that meant business, and the ranch adjusted to winter operations with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it before. Extra feed runs, checking the stock for cold stress, reinforcing the barn's weaker walls against the wind that came from the north with a force that felt personal. Elena added a second layer of wool to her morning routine and started keeping the kitchen fire stoked higher through the night. The children were slower to slow down than the ranch. Owen had turned his attentions to the full November with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. He was out in the barn before breakfast every day without fail, and Patterson had started teaching him things in the quiet, patient way Patterson did everything, and Elena would sometimes catch Mercer watching from a distance with the careful expression of a man filing something away in a place where he kept the things that mattered most. Clara had discovered, somewhere in the accumulated weeks, that Elena kept a small journal. She had not read it. Elena was sure of this because Clara was the kind of child whose moral architecture included a genuine category for things that belonged to other people. But she had noticed it, and she had taken to leaving notes of her own in the kitchen. Small things. Owen was mean to me this morning, but I think he was worried about November. Or I counted 14 different kinds of birds today from the back window. Is that a lot? She left them without expectation of response, but Elena responded anyway, in writing, tucked under the same corner of the table where she always found them, and this small private correspondence became something that belonged entirely to the two of them. Mercer came upon one of these exchanges by accident, found Elena's note still on the table when he came for coffee before Clara had collected it, and read it without meaning to, and then stood very still for a moment before setting it back exactly where he'd found it and going to get his coffee. He didn't mention it to either of them. But that evening he helped Clara with her letters practice with more patience than usual, sitting beside her at the table long after Owen had given up and retreated to the barn. And when Clara finally got a particular word right that she'd been struggling with for 2 weeks, he said quietly, "Good," in a tone that had something in it she clearly needed, because she sat up straighter and read the next line without being asked. Elena watched all of this from the kitchen and thought about a man rebuilding himself so slowly he probably didn't know he was doing it. There was an evening in the second week of December when she was repairing a tear in Owen's winter coat, and Mercer came in from a late check of the stock, still in his cold weather gear, and stood at the stove warming his hands. The children were asleep. The house had that particular quality of late evenings in winter. Pressed in, self-contained, the darkness outside making the inside feel more real. "I used to do that," he said, nodding at the coat. She looked up. "So?" "Eleanor, their mother. She used to hand me things to sew." He half smiled, which was the most expression she had seen on his face to date, and was therefore slightly startling. "Said my stitches were better. Steadier hands." "Were they?" "Probably. I used to work with small tools before the ranch." He was quiet a moment, still facing the stove. "Watchmaker for a year, before I came west." Elena set down the coat for a moment. "A watchmaker?" "I was 19. It was my uncle's trade." He turned, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, which was the most relaxed posture she had seen him take up indoors. "I wasn't suited for it long term. Too small a world for me, I think, but the stitching stayed." He nodded at the coat again. "You're pulling the thread too tight on the left side." She looked at her work. He was right. She adjusted. "She kept a journal too," he said then, quietly, not looking at anything. "Eleanor, after I couldn't read it for a year, then I read it all at once. Then I put it away." Elena held the coat in her hands and waited. "She wrote about the children," he said. "Mostly, but she wrote about the ranch too, about what she wanted it to become." He paused. "Some of what you've been doing, the accounts, the supply situation, it's close to what she had in her notes, what she was planning before she got sick." The fire settled in the stove. A piece of wood shifted. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "I'm not sure it's something that needs doing. He stopped. "I thought you should know." Elena looked at him carefully. "I think it means she was smart," she said, "and that the problems she saw were real problems worth solving. That's all." He nodded slowly. Whether it was all, neither of them said. But the house held the warmth of the fire, and the conversation sat between them with the weight of something real, not performed. And Elena went back to the coat stitching, and Mercer got his coffee, and they stayed in that kitchen together for another hour without needing to fill the quiet with anything more than what was already there. She fixed the stitching on the left side where she'd pulled it too tight. His hands, steadier than hers. His eye for what was slightly wrong. She thought, people show you who they are in the smallest corrections, if you pay attention. She was paying attention, and somewhere under all the work and all the caution and all the very good reasons to keep her own walls standing, she was starting to understand that what she felt in this house, not the ease of it, nothing about this life was easy, but what she felt in the bones of this place, in the kitchen at night and in the barn at dawn, and in the space between Owen's careful trust and Clara's small folded notes, was the particular feeling of somewhere she was supposed to be. She had not felt that before. Not once in 18 years. She pulled the last stitch through the coat and knotted it. Outside, the wind crossed the open land with its familiar cold authority. Inside, the fire held. The coat hung on its peg by the door, Owen's name stitched into the collar lining in Elena's careful hand, something she'd added without announcement, a small private mark that said this belongs to someone who belongs here. Owen had noticed it and said nothing, but he had worn the coat every day since without complaint, which from Owen was approximately equivalent to a speech. December settled into the ranch like a long exhale. The work didn't slow. If anything, winter created its own particular urgencies, its own daily emergencies of frozen water lines and stock that needed checking in the early dark. But the pace of it changed, became more interior, more focused on the immediate radius of warmth and provision. The world shrank to the size of what could be managed, and within that smaller world, something was shifting that none of them had named yet, and all of them could feel. Mercer had started talking more at supper. Not dramatically more. He was not a man who would ever be accused of excess in conversation, but the quality of his presence at the table had changed. He asked questions now, with some regularity, about the supply arrangements Elena had been renegotiating, about Cody's progress on the remaining North Pasture work, about what book Clara was reading and what Owen had observed about November's growth that week. He listened to the answers with genuine attention. When Owen said something that was both incorrect and passionately held, He corrected him in the specific way of someone who respected the passion enough to set the record straight rather than just letting it go. It was, Elena thought, watching this one evening over the rim of her coffee cup, what a family looked like when it was remembering how to be one, not a reconstruction of something lost. You couldn't reconstruct that, and trying would only show the seams, something new, built out of the available materials by people who were all, in their different ways, learning to want things again. She didn't let herself sit with that thought too long. She had become careful about thoughts like that. It was on a Thursday, 2 weeks into December, when the first sign appeared. Owen came in from the barn at mid-morning, looking flushed and moving fast, and Elena registered immediately that something was off. His color was wrong, too high in the cheeks, and his eyes had a brightness that was not excitement. She was at the counter, and she turned fully when he came through the door. "Owen." "I'm fine," he said, which was the thing children always said when they were not fine and knew an adult was looking at them. "Come here." "I'm going to get Clara "Owen." She said it with enough quiet weight that he stopped. He came to the counter. She put her hand on his forehead and felt what she had feared, a heat that had no business being there in the body of a child who had been out in a cold barn for an hour. "I'm not sick," he said. "It's probably just from the cold. The transition." "Maybe," she said. She kept her hand where it was. "How long have you felt warm?" He thought about it. "Since last night, maybe." "Did you sleep?" "Some." He looked at her. "Don't tell Papa yet. He worries." "I know he does," Elena said. "That's because he loves you. Go upstairs and get in bed." "But November Patterson will check on November. Go." He went, which told her more than his temperature had, because Owen's willingness to comply without argument was a reliable indicator of how bad he actually felt. She went to find Margaret. Margaret was in her room with the afternoon light coming sideways through the window, resting her hands in the way she'd taken to doing in the cold months. She looked up when Elena appeared in the doorway and read Elena's face with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention to the people in this house for 7 years. "How high?" she asked. "High enough," Elena said. "He says since last night." Margaret was already getting up. "Check Clara." Elena had already thought of it, but hearing it from Margaret turned it from a thought into something colder. She went down the hall to the small room Clara used for her morning lessons and found her at the table with her reading book, looking up when Elena came in with an expression that shifted quickly when she saw Elena's face. "What's wrong?" "How do you feel?" Elena asked. She crossed the room and put her hand on Clara's forehead before the girl could answer. The same heat. Slightly less, but the same source. "I've been cold all morning," Clara said. "I thought it was the room. I kept adding more wood to the fire, but I was still—" She stopped. Her voice had gone smaller. "Owen too?" "Owen too," Elena said. Clara looked at her with those dark eyes that were so much older than 6 and said, "Is it like what Mama had?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Elena kept her face level. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to take care of both of you first and worry about what it is later." "Can you walk to your room?" "Of course I can walk," Clara said, with a small flicker of her usual self. "Good. Then go." By early afternoon, both children were in bed, their rooms separated by the hallway but connected by the periodic sound of one calling out to the other. Owen checking on Clara, Clara telling Owen to stop coughing so loud. A bickering that was also, Elena understood, comfort. As long as they could hear each other, they were still here. Margaret had the medicines she kept for the household arrayed on the kitchen table. The willow bark for the fever, the pine needle tea she swore by, the mustard poultice she used for chest congestion. She had also sent the young hand, Cody, who had returned from the north pasture work earlier that week, to find Mercer in the east field. Elena was in Owen's room when she heard the front door and then Mercer's boots on the stairs, faster than his usual pace. He appeared in the doorway of Owen's room and stopped. Owen was asleep, his face flushed and his breathing slightly too quick, one hand curled near his face the way he slept when he wasn't feeling well. Mercer stood in the doorway, and something crossed his face that he could not entirely control. A crack in the careful surface, fast and deep. Elena stepped quietly out into the hallway and pulled Owen's door to without latching it. Mercer was looking at the door. "How bad?" he said. "High fevers, both of them. Clara's is a little lower." She kept her voice even. "They're not in crisis, but I want to watch them through the night. The illness—" He stopped. Eleanor had the same. "I know," Elena said. She had it worse than the children, but it started the same. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Owen's door with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had already fallen into once and had not recovered from and was now being asked to look at again. "I sent for the doctor in Dunmore. He may not make it before tomorrow in this weather." "I understand. I've dealt with fevers before." She watched his face. "Silas." He looked at her. She had not used his first name before. Neither of them had registered it until she heard it in the air between them and couldn't take it back. "They're going to need us steady," she said. "Both of us. Can you do that?" He took a breath, controlled, deliberate. "Yes," he said. "Then go sit with Clara. I'll be with Owen. We check in with each other every hour." He nodded. He moved toward Clara's room. At the door he stopped and looked back. "Elena," returning it, her name in his mouth. "Tell me if anything changes." "Immediately," she said. He went in. She heard him speak to Clara, very low, and heard Clara's voice respond, and the sound of it, the small tired voice of a sick child finding her father in the room, did something to Elena's chest that she didn't have room to feel right now, and filed away for later. She went back to Owen. The night came down hard. By 7 in the evening, Owen's fever had climbed, and by 9 it was high enough that Elena stripped the heavy quilts off the bed and replaced them with a single sheet, cooling the cloth in the water basin and laying it across his forehead and the back of his neck, working in the rotation that would keep his temperature from climbing further. Cool cloth, change, cool cloth, change. The willow bark tea in small, careful sips when he was lucid enough to swallow. Owen drifted in and out of sleep, and in the drifting spoke disconnected pieces of things. November's name, something about the fence, once a word she didn't catch that sounded like it might have been his mother's name. Elena answered what could be answered, sat with what couldn't. In the hallway between the rooms, they crossed paths every hour as she'd said, and the crossings were wordless exchanges of information, a look, a nod, a slight shift in expression that communicated what words would have taken longer to say. Clara was holding steady. Owen's fever was not dropping. The doctor would not arrive before morning. Around midnight, Mercer came to Owen's doorway. He looked at his son for a long moment. Owen was awake in that shallow, exhausting way of high fevers, eyes half open, not really seeing anything. "He doesn't look right," Mercer said, very quiet. "No," Elena said, "but he's fighting it." "Eleanor looked like this." He stopped. 3 days in, she looked like this. "He's not 3 days in. He's 1 day in. It's not the same." "You don't know that." She looked at him directly. "No?" she said. "I don't know it. I'm telling you what I believe, which is different." She stood up from the chair beside Owen's bed. "Come sit with him. I need to check on Clara and get more water, and I need you here while I'm gone." He came in. He sat in the chair she'd vacated and looked at his son, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. All the armor he'd spent 3 years building around himself gone. Just a father sitting beside a sick child at midnight, trying to hold himself together by main force. She went to the hallway. She stood there for 30 seconds with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, breathing carefully, letting herself feel the fear before she had to go back to work. This was a thing she had learned about herself young, that feelings didn't disappear when you ignored them. They accumulated, and the only safe way to manage them in a crisis was to take 30 seconds here and there and actually feel them before putting them back in their place. So she took her 30 seconds with the wall cold at her back and the fear sitting heavy in her chest. Then she went to Clara's room. Clara was awake. She was lying very still in the way sick children sometimes did, as if stillness was a contribution they could make to their own recovery. "How do you feel?" Elena asked. "Hot," Clara said, "and my head hurts." "I know. I'm going to get you more tea and change the cloth. She did these things with the practiced efficiency of the previous hours. Clara watched her from the pillow with those measuring eyes. Is Owen worse than me? She asked. He's sick like you, Elena said carefully. Maybe a little higher fever. He always runs hot, Clara said. Even when we were babies, according to Margaret. She said Owen ran hot and I ran cold. That's useful information, Elena said. Papa's scared, Clara said. It was not a question. Yes, because of Mama. Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't want him to be scared. I know, Elena said. That's why we're going to get better, both of you. You can't promise that, Clara said, with that unnerving accuracy she had, exactly like her father's. No, Elena said, but I can promise that I'm going to fight for it, all night, and your father is in with Owen right now doing the same thing. She looked at the girl. You are not going through this alone. Do you understand me? Clara looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face was very young and very old at the same time. Okay, she said finally. Elena stayed until she drifted into uneasy sleep. Then she went back to Owen's room. 2 a.m. was the hardest hour. Owen had spoken clearly and suddenly out of what had appeared to be sleep. I don't want to go. Mercer had gone rigid in the chair. Elena crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hand on Owen's forehead and said, You're not going anywhere. You're right here. You're in your bed. It's too hot, Owen said. I know. I'm fixing it. She changed the cloth. He settled. She looked at Mercer over the boy's head. Mercer looked undone, not visibly falling apart. He was too controlled for that. But the foundation under his composure was cracking and she could see it. Come outside for a minute, she said. I'm not leaving him. 1 minute. He's asleep. I need you functional, and you are going to lose it in front of him if you don't take a minute. He looked at her. He looked at Owen. He got up and followed her into the hallway, where the single lamp made shadows of both of them against the wall. He's not dying, she said. Her voice was low and direct. His fever is high, but it's not climbing anymore. The willow bark is working. He's fighting. You don't know for certain, she said. I know. But here's what I do know. The doctor is coming in the morning. Owen is breathing well. His color hasn't changed in the last 2 hours. And Clara's fever has actually dropped a degree in the last hour, which means her body is already turning it. She looked at him steadily. This is not what happened with Eleanor. This is different children at different ages with a different person here to help. Mercer stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, the same wall she'd used hours earlier, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, when Eleanor got sick, I didn't know what to do. I knew the practical things. I did all of them. But I felt... He stopped. I felt completely alone in it. I know, Elena said. You're not alone in it tonight. He looked at her. The lamp between them was small, and the hallway was close, and there were many things in his face that she did not try to interpret, because this was not the time for interpretation. Go back in, she said. Talk to him. Even if he's asleep, especially if he's asleep. Let him hear your voice. What do I say? Anything real, she said. It doesn't have to be important. He just needs to know you're there. He went back in. She heard him begin to talk, low, steady, his voice finding a rhythm that was quieter and more personal than anything she'd heard from him before. She didn't listen to the words. She went to check on Clara. Clara was sleeping more peacefully. Her skin was still warm, but the high brightness had faded slightly. Elena sat in the chair beside her and kept the cloth rotation going and listened to the house settle around her, the fire in the stove downstairs, the wind outside, Mercer's voice down the hall, the small sounds of the children breathing. She thought about Owen saying, I don't want to go, and how it had sounded like a 6-year-old talking about the fever, and also somehow like something older and deeper. The same thing Clara said about their mother, the impressions without the memories, the absence that shaped everything even when it wasn't being spoken of. These children had been growing up in a house where something important was missing, and they had been managing that absence, both of them, in the ways available to them. Owen through defense and action, Clara through observation and careful feeling. They had been doing it without enough help. And their father had been doing the same thing at a larger scale, managing the absence by removing himself from anything that might require him to feel it. Elena understood this because she had done a version of it herself. After her mother died, after her brothers left, after it became clear that her father's grand plans were going to consume whatever remained, she had made herself smaller than she was, had decided, without realizing she was deciding, to need as little as possible so there would be nothing left to lose. She had been doing it right up until the moment she climbed the steps of an auction platform and stood in front of a crowd that wanted to reduce her to a purchase price. And then a man had outbid Orville Dunst and not explained why. And his children had tried to run her off and failed. And somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, bread and fence lines and cold steps in the early morning and notes left under the corner of a kitchen table, she had become, without making any announcement about it, a person who cared about what happened in this house as much as she had ever cared about anything. That was not a small thing to realize at 3 in the morning in a sick child's room. She sat with it. The lamp burned low, and she turned it up and kept the cloth rotation going and let the realization sit there in the chair with her without running from it. The hour before dawn was when Owen's fever broke. She knew it before she checked. She had been watching his breathing, and it changed, deepened, lost the shallow quality it had carried through the night. She crossed the hallway and looked in. Mercer was still in the chair, awake, and he looked up when she came to the doorway. His breathing changed, Elena said quietly. Mercer put his hand on Owen's forehead. She saw his face change, the relief moving through it like something physical, something that had to move to get out. He stayed like that for a moment, hand on his son's head, not speaking. Owen opened his eyes. They were clearer than they'd been in 12 hours. He looked at his father first, then at Elena in the doorway. "Is Clara okay?" he said. His voice was rough. "Clara's fever broke an hour ago," Elena said. "She's sleeping." Owen considered this with the serious air of a boy who has been carrying worry and is now setting it down carefully. "Okay," he said. He closed his eyes again. In 30 seconds, he was breathing in the deep, even way of real sleep. Mercer stood up from the chair. He stood in the middle of the small room and put both hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment, just long enough to contain whatever was happening in him. Then he lowered them. Elena was still in the doorway. He walked toward her and stopped when he was close, closer than their usual proximity, and she looked at him and saw a man who had been stripped down to something very basic by the night. Not broken, nothing like broken, but raw in the way that extreme nights make people raw, when there's nothing left to maintain the careful distance they keep around themselves in ordinary life. "Thank you," he said. The words came out rough like Owen's voice, worn by hours. "You were here too," she said. "You didn't—" He stopped. Started again. "You didn't have to stay all night. The contract doesn't—" "Stop," she said. Not harshly. "Don't bring the contract into this room." He stopped. He looked at her. Something in the look was a kind of opening. A door that had been shut for a long time pushed ajar by the night, and the fever, and the breaking of the fever, and the fact of her standing here in the doorway still, after all of it. She was not ready for what was behind that door, and she didn't think he was either. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll watch them until the doctor arrives." He didn't move immediately. He stood there for another moment in the pale pre-dawn light from the window, looking at her, and she held the look without flinching and without stepping toward it, because the balance of the thing was delicate, and she had learned, in 18 years of delicate things, that balance mattered more than momentum. Then he nodded. He went to his room. Elena went downstairs to rebuild the kitchen fire and put water on. Margaret found her there 20 minutes later, fully dressed despite the early hour, and looked at Elena's face and the state of the kitchen and the tiredness around Elena's eyes and understood all of it in the way she understood most things. "Both broke?" she said. "Both," Elena said. Margaret sat down at the table. She folded her hands, her bad hands, the ones that had given way before Elena arrived, and looked at them for a moment. "You know," she said, "in 7 years, I've never once seen him ask anyone to stay." Elena poured the hot water. "He didn't ask me." "No," Margaret said. "That's what I mean." The kitchen filled with the smell of coffee, and the early light began to come through the window, gray first and then pink. the same sequence Elena had watched from the back step with Clara weeks ago. She thought about what Clara had said that morning. I think about the idea of her, and thought about impressions, and how much of what shaped a person was not the thing itself, but the shape the thing left when it was gone. The doctor arrived at mid-morning, examined both children with the thorough competence of a man who had been treating frontier illnesses for 20 years, confirmed that the fevers had broken cleanly, prescribed rest and fluids and the same willow bark Elena had already been using, and charged $3 that Mercer paid without discussion. After he left, Owen slept until noon and then woke up and asked for bread. "It's not Tuesday," Elena said. "I know," he said. "But I want bread." She made him bread. It was the best batch she'd turned out yet. She'd finally found the right pressure, the right rhythm, the thing Owen had been trying to explain to her since October. She brought it up to him warm, and he ate 2 slices without speaking and then said, with the directness that was pure Owen, "I heard Papa talking to me last night, when I was mostly asleep." Elena sat in the chair beside his bed. "What did he say?" "He talked about the ranch," Owen said. "About when he first built it. Things I didn't know." He paused. "He talked about Mama a little, not like he usually talks about her. Different." "How different?" Owen thought about this with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. "Like she was a real person," he said. "Not like someone to be sad about. Like someone he knew." Elena looked at this boy, this 6-year-old who had been running defense for 3 years around a grief he'd only experienced as an absence, and felt something very large and very quiet in her chest. "She was a real person," Elena said. "I know," Owen said. "I just don't usually hear him remember her that way." He picked at the edge of his bread. "I think the night scared him." "I think so too." "But he didn't leave," Owen said. He looked at Elena. "He stayed all night." "He did." Owen nodded slowly, like this was something he was filing away in the same place his father filed important things. Then he ate another piece of bread and said, in an entirely different tone, "Can I see November this afternoon if I feel better?" "Tomorrow," Elena said. "If you rest today." He started to argue and then thought better of it, which was new. "Okay," he said. She went to the doorway. He said, without looking up from his bread, "Elena." She stopped. "I'm glad you didn't leave," he said. "Last night. I'm glad you were here." She stood in the doorway and let herself feel it. The full weight of it. The thing she had filed away in the dark hours of 3 in the morning and hadn't looked at since. This house. These children. This man who had stood in a hallway at 2 in the morning and said I felt completely alone in it. "I'm glad I was here too," she said. She went downstairs. In the kitchen, she stood at the window and looked out at the snow-covered yard and the barn and the far corrals, and past all of it, the open land that went on until it met the sky. And she thought about how she had arrived here with 1 bag and a contract, and the determined intention to feel as little as possible for as long as the contract required. She had made a poor job of that plan. Outside, the snow lay clean and still over everything, and the winter light on it made the whole world look like it had just been remade into something quieter and more honest than it had been before. And Elena stood at the kitchen window long enough to understand, without any remaining argument against it, that whatever came next, she was not going to be able to pretend she had no stake in this place and the people in it. That door in the hallway before dawn, the one she hadn't stepped toward. She was starting to understand it was going to open whether she was ready or not. The children recovered faster than anyone deserved after a night like that. By the second day, Owen was in the barn with November, against doctor's orders and with his father's tacit permission, which was communicated through the specific silence Mercer used when he had decided something was going to happen, regardless of what he said, and had chosen to save his words for something else. By the third day, Clara was at the kitchen table with her reading book and her notes, writing something long and considered that she covered with her arm when Elena passed, which Elena did not acknowledge because Clara's private work was Clara's private work. By the fourth day, the house had returned to its winter rhythms, and that should have felt like a return to normal, except that nothing was quite where it had been before the fever nights. Things had shifted. Small things, in the way that small things are sometimes the only evidence of large changes underneath. Mercer had started coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not every evening. Not with any announcement or stated purpose. He would appear after the children were in bed, get his coffee, and sometimes sit at the table with the ranch accounts or the supply records, and sometimes just sit. Elena worked her evening prep around his presence, and he worked his accounts around hers, and neither of them commented on the arrangement because commenting on it would have required naming it, and naming it would have changed whatever delicate and unexamined thing it currently was. But she felt it, the weight of something that had no name yet, but was real enough to have weight. On the 5th day after the fevers, she was checking the cold stores in the cellar when she heard him on the steps above her. She didn't look up. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice had the quality of something that had been decided upon after careful consideration. Elena set down the inventory board. "All right," she said. He came down the rest of the steps. The cellar was low-ceilinged, and the lamp she'd brought cast both of them in the same small radius of light. He stood a few feet away with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the middle distance for a moment, in the way he did when he was organizing what he intended to say before saying it. "The contract," he said. "I've been thinking about it." Elena waited. "It runs another 8 months." He looked at her then. "You know what I paid for it?" "Yes." "I want to release it," he said. "The contract. I want to—" He stopped, restarted. "I want you to be free of it, the debt, the obligation, all of it. Whatever you decide to do after that." He paused again. "That's yours to decide." The cellar was very quiet. Somewhere above them the house settled in the cold, a creak of wood, the muffled sound of the wind. Elena looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because she should have done it sooner." The words came out with an edge of something, not anger, more like self-directed frustration, the kind that comes from a person who holds themselves to standards that are sometimes unreasonably high. "What I did at the auction, I told myself it was the practical solution to a real problem. The children needed someone who couldn't simply walk out, and that was true." He met her eyes. "It was also a thing I'm not comfortable with, the way I went about it." "You kept me from Dunst," Elena said. "I kept you for myself," he said. "The reasons matter." She held his gaze. This was the thing about Silas Mercer. He was honest in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable, because it demanded honesty in return and left no room for the comfortable half-truths people used to smooth over their dealings with each other. "What would releasing the contract mean practically?" she asked. "I'd pay you wages. Going forward, equal to what I'd pay any qualified household manager, which is more than what the contract stipulates." He took a breath. "You'd have the choice to stay or leave, without consequence either way." "And if I leave?" "Then you leave," he said, "with money in your pocket and a reference letter that says exactly what you've done here, which is considerable." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them burned steady in the still air. "You think I might leave," she said. "I think you should have the choice," he said. "Those are different things." Elena picked up the inventory board and then set it back down because she didn't actually need it. She just needed something to do with her hands for a moment. She said, "When I was standing on that platform in Dunmore, I was trying to think about what I was going to do next. Past the auction, past whoever bought the contract. I had nothing specific about just the general intention of surviving whatever came after and eventually building something of my own." She paused. "I didn't think that would happen here. I thought here was temporary. A stopgap." Mercer said nothing. He was listening in the full way he listened to things that mattered. "I've been trying for weeks to talk myself back into thinking of it that way," she said. "Temporary, practical, a contract." She looked at him directly. "I haven't managed it." The lamp flickered once, very slightly, and steadied. "The children," she said. "Owen's bread, Clara's notes, the accounts, the supply chain, the fence problem." She stopped. "You, in that hallway at 2 a.m, saying you felt alone in it." She stopped again. "I'm not temporary here. I've known that for a while. I've just been working out whether to say it." Mercer looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over 3 months of careful attention, the one that meant something important was happening behind the controlled surface that he didn't yet know how to bring forward. "What are you saying?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "I'm saying I don't want to leave," she said. Not because of the contract, not because I don't have options, because this is where I want to be. She held his gaze steadily. I'm saying that before you release the contract, you should know that. The seller was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Mercer stood very still. Then he said, "That changes what I was going to say next." What were you going to say next? He took a breath. In 3 months, she had not once seen him uncertain. Careful, yes. Controlled, yes, but not uncertain. He was uncertain now. It sat oddly on him, like a coat cut for a different frame, but it also made him more real than she had ever seen him, and she found she could look at him more directly because of it. I was going to tell you, he said, that I had no right to ask anything of you beyond the contract terms. That whatever I... He stopped, chose different words. That however I'd come to regard the situation here had no bearing on what you chose to do with your freedom. That was very careful of you, Elena said. I was trying to be fair. I know. She looked at him. You're almost always trying to be fair. It's one of the things about you. He stood there for a moment with that assessment sitting between them. Then he said, How long have you been this direct about things? Since about the 3rd day after I arrived, she said. I just waited to see if you could handle it. Something crossed his face, the beginning of a real smile, not the near smile she had seen occasionally, but the full thing, brief and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, made him look younger and less armored and entirely himself. It was there and gone fast, but she had seen it. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly, which I think you will regardless. Go ahead. The night of the fever, he said, in the hallway. I said I felt alone when Eleanor was sick. I said it because it was true, and because the night had... He paused. I don't usually say things like that. I know. I've been wondering since then whether it was something I said because the night was extreme and I was... He searched for the word. Undone. Or whether it was something I said because you were the person I was saying it to. Elena looked at him. I think it was both, she said carefully, and I think you know that. He nodded slowly. Not like he was agreeing so much as like he was confirming something he'd already worked out and was checking against her answer. I'm not a man who... He stopped, started again. I don't do anything quickly. I'm not built that way. I know that too, she said. What I'm trying to say, and doing poorly, you're not doing poorly, she said, is that I don't want you to leave, he said. Not as an employee. I want... He stopped one more time, and this time the stop was longer. And when he came out of it, his voice was quieter but steadier, like he'd found the right ground under him. I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because of any contract or debt or obligation, because I think you've become... He looked at her directly. You've become essential to this house, and to me, and I'm aware that's a complicated thing to say to someone who arrived here under the circumstances you did. Elena said nothing for a moment. The lamp burned between them. It is complicated, she said. You're right about that. She took a breath, and I think we both need to know that I'm not saying what I'm saying because I have nowhere else to go. I'm saying it because of exactly what it is, which is that I have found something here I have never had anywhere before, and I'm not leaving it. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, All right, she said. They stood in the cellar for another moment in the quiet that had shifted again into something else. Not resolved, nothing was fully resolved. This was the beginning of something, not the end of anything, but present and real and acknowledged. I'll draw up new papers, he said finally. Wage terms, no contract. Fair enough, she said. He took the lamp because she still needed to finish the inventory and went back upstairs. And Elena stood in the dimmer dark with the inventory board in her hands and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, not in the cellar, not even in the words, but in the accumulation of everything that had led to the words, every Tuesday with the bread and every note under the table and every morning on the back step and every honest exchange in a hallway or a kitchen, all of it added up to something she could finally look at directly without flinching. She finished the inventory by feel, half her mind somewhere else entirely, and went upstairs. Margaret knew. Elena could tell by the way she looked at her over breakfast the next morning. That's not asking, not commenting, just a particular quality of attention from someone who had been watching this house for 7 years and understood its changes the way you understood the changes of weather you'd watched long enough. Elena said nothing, and Margaret said nothing, and they worked the kitchen together in the comfortable parallel they had built over 3 months, and the morning moved forward. What Elena had not anticipated was Owen. She had understood that children were perceptive. She had even understood that these children, specifically, were more perceptive than most, shaped by years of watching the adults around them for signs of what was coming. What she had not fully accounted for was the speed. Owen appeared at the kitchen table at mid-morning on a Saturday, 3 days after the cellar conversation, and sat down with the specific weight of a person who has a thing they intend to say and have been thinking about how to say it. Elena was at the counter. She waited. "I heard you," Owen said. "And Papa, in the cellar." She turned around. Owen was looking at the table, not at her. His jaw had the set of someone managing embarrassment. "Not on purpose," he said. "I was coming to get the preserves jar, and I heard you talking, and I—" He stopped. "I didn't mean to hear it." "But you did," Elena said. "Yes." A pause. "I heard most of it." She came and sat across from him. He looked up at her then, and his face had the raw quality she'd seen during the fever night. No defense, no performance, just Owen himself underneath all the strategy. "Are you upset?" she asked. "No." He said it immediately, then seemed to check whether it was true, then said it again. "No, I'm—" He stopped. "I didn't know Papa could talk like that. About things like that." "He doesn't, usually," Elena said. "I know." Owen looked at his hands. "He talked to me when I was sick, like that. I didn't know if I'd imagined it or not. But he does know how." He paused. "He just doesn't." "That's true," Elena said. "He's better when you're here," Owen said. It came out plainly, with the directness he brought to things he had thought about carefully and decided to just say. He searched. "He used to just be here. In the house. But it was like he wasn't. Do you know what I mean?" "Yes," she said, "and now he's actually here." Owen looked at her. Clara said that too. She said it differently, but she meant the same thing. Elena looked at this boy across the kitchen table and thought about what it cost a 6-year-old to say something like that. To name the difference between a father who was present and a father who was only technically occupying the same space, to say it to someone outside the family, to say it at all. "Owen," she said, "I want you to know that what I said to your father about wanting to be here, that's about all of you, not just him. You understand?" Owen nodded. "I know," he said. He met her eyes. "Claire and I talked about it. When the other housekeepers came, He stopped. Started again with the particular honesty that sometimes came to children in unguarded moments. "We didn't want anyone to stay because we thought if someone stayed, it would mean we didn't need Mama anymore, like replacing her." The kitchen was very quiet. "And now?" Elena asked. Owen was silent for a moment. "Now I think we were wrong about how it works," he said. "I think—" He struggled. "I think it's not replacing. I think Mama is Mama and you are you, and those are different things, and both of them can be real." Elena held very still. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "Clara figured that out first," Owen admitted. "She's better at that kind of thing." "She is," Elena agreed, when she could. "But I got there," Owen said, with a small flash of the competitive spirit that was so particularly his. Then, more quietly, "I'm glad you're staying." "I'm glad I'm staying too," Elena said. He got up from the table. At the door he turned. "Elena." He said her name with the bridge quality it had taken on, the way he used it when he was about to say something that mattered. "Clara left you a note this morning, under the table." He nodded at the kitchen table. "She made me promise not to tell you she was nervous about it." He left. Elena looked at the kitchen table. She reached under the corner where the notes always were and found a folded piece of paper, smaller than Clara's usual notes, more carefully folded. She opened it. I'm glad you didn't leave when we tried to make you. I think I was trying to make you leave because I didn't want you to stay. That doesn't make sense. Clara. Below it, in smaller letters, like an afterthought that had been very carefully considered. P.S. You can call me yours if you want. I won't mind. Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. The note in her hands, the winter light coming through the window, the sounds of the ranch outside, Patterson in the barn, the horses, the particular quality of cold air when it carries the sounds of work across open ground. She thought about a girl who had been 3 years old when she lost her mother and had spent the years since building careful walls against the possibility of wanting something and having it leave. She thought about the note as an act of courage that Clara would never have named as courage because Clara would have called it practical or reasonable or simply honest, the way she called most things. Elena folded the note and put it in her pocket. She would answer it, as she always did. But she needed a moment first. Check. The trouble with Dunst arrived, as most trouble arrived, when things had settled enough that you'd stopped fully watching for it. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by the supply rider in the second week of January, addressed to Silas Mercer in a clerk's careful hand. Elena was in the front room when he read it. She watched his face and saw the controlled stilling that meant something had arrived that required him to think before reacting. He handed it to her without comment. It was from the land office in Dunmore. Formal language, measured sentences, the kind of prose that was designed to convey official weight. The substance of it was this. A complaint had been filed with the Territorial Land Office regarding the northern boundary of the Mercer property. The complainant, unnamed in this letter, though the clerk's note at the bottom referenced a filing by O. Dunst and Associates, claimed that the survey establishing the northern line of the Mercer Ranch had been conducted incorrectly in 1871, and that approximately 400 acres currently used and claimed by the Mercer operation fell within boundaries that should properly belong to the adjacent land parcel, which Dunst had recently acquired. Elena read it twice. Then she handed it back. He bought the land to the north, she said. He's been buying up parcels in this territory for 2 years, Mercer said. I knew that. I didn't think he'd move on the survey. The original survey was 1871. I was here for it. The surveyor was a man named Cole. He worked for the territorial government. Mercer set the letter on the table. The markers should still be in place, most of them. Do you have the original survey documents? He looked at her. Yes. Where? In the strongbox, with the deed. I want to see them, Elena said. He brought the strongbox from his study. She sat at the kitchen table with the original survey documents spread in front of her. The deed, the survey map, the surveyor's notes, the recorded measurements. She had been reading accounts and supply records for months by this point, and the discipline of following numbers carefully was not unfamiliar to her, but this was different. This was legal territory she had no formal training in, and she was aware of her own limits here even as she pushed against them. What she could see clearly was this. The original survey used a creek bed as one reference point for the northern boundary. Creek beds moved. Over 11 years, with the kind of seasonal flooding this territory got, a creek bed could shift enough to make a surveyor's reference point ambiguous. If Dunst had a newer survey that used the current creek position rather than the 1871 position, the discrepancy in the boundary line would be real, technically speaking, even if the spirit of the original claim was unambiguous. He's not wrong about the creek, she said. Mercer looked at her sharply. I'm not saying his claim is legitimate, she said. I'm saying the creek is where his argument lives. If he's hired a surveyor who measured from the current creek bed, he has a number that looks different from yours. She looked at the map. What's on those 400 acres? Grazing pasture. Winter pasture, mostly. We put the breeding stock there in... He stopped. January, she said. Yes. So this letter arrives exactly when you're moving the breeding stock onto the contested ground, Elena said. That's not coincidence. No, Mercer said. He wants you to pull the stock off the north pasture while the complaint is processed, because that's the civil thing to do when there's a boundary dispute in progress, which means your breeding operation is disrupted for however long the land office takes to resolve it. She looked up at him. Which could be months. Mercer stood at the end of the table with his arms crossed and his expression carefully controlled. He filed this in January on purpose, he said. If he'd filed it in the fall, I'd have had time to respond before the stock needed to move. He's careful, Elena said. You said that yourself. I need a lawyer. You need the 1871 surveyor's original field notes, Elena said, which may be archived with the territorial government records in the land office. If Cole recorded his measurements against a fixed landmark rather than the creek bed, a rock formation, a tree, anything stable, the creek movement doesn't matter. Your boundary is wherever Cole's fixed measurement puts it. She paused. Do you know if Cole recorded his field notes separately from the official survey documents? Mercer looked at her. I don't know. I never had reason to look. We need to find out. She looked at the map again. And we need to move carefully. If you pull the stock off the north pasture without being compelled to, it looks like an acknowledgement of the dispute. If you leave them there while being hostile to the complaint, you look like you're defying a legitimate process. She thought about it. You need to respond to the land office formally, acknowledge the complaint, indicate you're reviewing the historical documentation, request the full timeline for their process. That's not combative and it's not concessive. It's correct. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. You've thought about legal process before, he said. I've watched my father navigate debt collectors for years, she said. It's a related skill. She looked up at him. But you should also talk to an actual lawyer. I can help you organize the documentation and think through the approach. I can't replace someone who knows the territorial land statutes. There's a lawyer in Dunmore, he said. Alden Marsh. He's handled boundary disputes before. Can you trust him? Mercer thought about it. He's not in Dunst's pocket, if that's what you mean. He's handled cases against Dunst before. Then write to him today, Elena said. Before you do anything else, and... She stopped. What? Don't tell anyone in town about the letter yet. Not what's in it. Dunst filed this publicly, which means he wants it talked about. He wants people discussing whether your north pasture is legitimately yours. Every conversation about it in Dunmore is free advertising for his version of the story. She looked at him steadily. Let him wonder why you're not reacting. Mercer looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was part calculation and part something else. The look she had come to recognize as him noting something, filing it in that place where he kept the things that mattered. Where did you learn to think this way? He asked. From watching what happened when people didn't, she said. He wrote to Alden Marsh that afternoon. Elena drafted the letter to the land office while Mercer worked through his own response to the lawyer. And they sat at the kitchen table in the winter afternoon with the lamp between them and the document spread around them and worked through it the way they had worked through the accounts and the supply questions and the fence problem. Two people who thought differently, but whose thinking, when combined, arrived at something neither would have reached alone. It was Cody who noticed, coming in for the early supper, that there were papers all over the kitchen table, and both Mercer and Elena bent over them, and he backed out of the kitchen quietly, the way a man did when he understood he had walked into something, and told Patterson about it later in the barn. Patterson said, "Good," and left it at that. Alden Marsh arrived from Dunmore 9 days later. He was a compact, precise man in his late 50s who wore his coat like it mattered and spoke with the measured pace of someone who charged by the hour and had learned early that clarity was his most valuable professional asset. He reviewed the survey documents at the kitchen table while Mercer and Elena sat across from him. He asked 3 questions, all specific, all pointing at the same issue Elena had identified. Then he said, "The Cole field notes are the key. If they exist and they record a fixed landmark measurement, your boundary holds regardless of what the creek has done." "And if they don't exist?" Mercer asked. "Then we argue the historical use and possession, which is a longer process and a less certain outcome." Marsh looked at the map. But Cole was a methodical man. I've seen his work on other properties. He usually recorded more than the minimum. He looked up. Who identified the creek issue? Elena, Mercer said. Marsh looked at her. You read survey documents. I read anything that has numbers in it, she said. He looked at her a moment longer with the assessing expression of someone recalibrating something. Good eye, he said. Then back to Mercer. I'll go to the land office archive. If Cole's field notes were filed with the government record rather than given to you, they'll be there. He paused. I'll also look at what Dunst actually filed. The complaint language matters. How long? Mercer asked. 2 weeks to get to the archive and back, depending on what I find. He gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. Leave the stock where they are. Don't move them and don't make any public statements about the dispute. If anyone in town asks, you're reviewing the historical documentation. That's all. He left the next morning. In the 2 weeks that followed, the ranch operated as normally as it could while carrying the particular weight of something unresolved. Mercer was more contained than usual in those weeks. Not shut down, not the way he had been before the fever nights, but turned inward in the way of someone who was working something out and needed the inner space to do it. Elena gave him room for that. She had learned by now that pressing Silas Mercer when he was thinking was about as productive as pressing the bread too hard. You got the wrong result. Owen had no patience for the restraint and asked about the letter directly one evening at supper. Mercer looked at him for a moment and then said, level and honest, someone is trying to take part of our land. We're handling it. Owen absorbed this. Who? Dunst, Mercer said. Owen's face did something complicated. The man from the auction. Yes. He's trying to take our land because you outbid him, Owen said. It wasn't quite a question. People like Dunst usually have more than one reason for what they do, Mercer said, but that's part of it. Owen thought about this. Then he said, Elena's helping? She identified the legal issue, Mercer said, and organized the documentation. Owen looked at Elena with an expression she couldn't fully read, some combination of respect and something more protective, more proprietary, something that said that's ours and you're ours, and nobody takes from us without dealing with all of us. Clara said, in a voice that cut through the table noise with the quiet precision she'd inherited directly from her father, we should write a letter to the land office, too. Everyone looked at her. Owen and me, she said. We should write a letter saying we've lived on this land our whole lives and it's ours, and we know every foot of it. She looked at her father. Does that count for anything? Marsh looked surprised the first time Mercer mentioned it to him later. Then he said, actually, testimony of continuous use and possession by members of the household, including minors who have grown up on the property. It's not primary evidence, but it's not nothing, especially for a jury, if it gets that far. He paused. Let them write it. Clara wrote hers in careful letters that took her 2 evenings. Owen dictated his to Elena and then insisted on copying it out himself, even the parts he misspelled, because he said if he was going to put his name on it, he was going to write it himself. Mercer read both letters without commenting on them for a long moment. Then he folded them carefully and put them with the legal documents, and if he was not entirely composed when he did it, he had his back to the room, and neither Elena nor the children could see his face. Marsh returned on a Thursday, and Elena knew from his expression when he came through the door that he had found what they needed. He laid the Coalfield notes on the kitchen table. They were 11 years old, brown at the edges, written in the small, precise hand of a man who took his work seriously. The northern boundary measurement was recorded against a limestone outcropping, fixed and specific, with a distance noted in feet and chains. Not the creek. The creek was mentioned as an approximate visual reference, but the measurement itself was stone. The creek can move all it wants, Marsh said. Cole measured from rock. He looked at Mercer. Your boundary stands exactly where it did in 1871. Dunst's surveyor measured from the current creek position knowing this documentation existed or should have. Either he didn't look for it, which is negligent, or he looked for it and hoped it wasn't there, which is something worse. Can you prove which? Elena asked. I can prove the field notes were filed and accessible, Marsh said. Whether Dunst's people looked at them is harder to establish, but it doesn't matter much for the outcome. The boundary is clear. I'll file the response with the land office this week. He paused. The complaint will be dismissed. It may take another month, but the outcome isn't in question once they see Cole's notes. Mercer sat at the table looking at the field notes for a moment. Then he looked at Elena. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Marsh was watching them both with the quiet attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms. He picked up his documents and said, in the tone of someone who has noted something and is choosing discretion, "I'll send the invoice with my written report." He let himself out. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, January was doing what January did. Cold and clear and uncompromising, the sky a hard blue over the snow. Owen could be heard in the yard, something about November, his voice carrying the particular volume of a child who had forgotten other people existed. Mercer said, "I would have lost those 400 acres. "Maybe," Elena said. "Without the field notes argument, yes." He looked at her. "I didn't know about the creek issue. I wouldn't have looked for the field notes." "You would have found a lawyer who would have," she said. "Maybe. Eventually." He paused. "You found it in an afternoon." She looked at the documents on the table. "I found it because I was looking at what Dunst was actually arguing, not at the documents themselves," she said. "You were looking at the documents because that's where you expected the truth to be. I was looking for where someone might hide a lie." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you think?" "I grew up watching a man who made decisions with his heart and ignored what the numbers were actually saying," she said. "I learned to read the numbers first," she paused. "It's not always a comfortable way to think, but it's useful." "It saved the North Pasture," he said. "The coal field notes saved the North Pasture," she said. "I just knew to look for them." He was looking at her with the expression that had become familiar over months, the one with too many things behind it to name individually, the one she had been careful not to examine too closely because examining it would have required her to also examine what was happening in herself. And she had only recently admitted to herself that she was not, in fact, keeping a careful professional distance from Silas Mercer. She had not been keeping that distance for some time. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "I need to say something," he said, without the cellar conversation in front of it, without the fever night in front of it, without the contract or the land dispute or the practical situation in front of it. He paused, and she could see him finding the ground under him again, the way she'd watched him find it before. "I love you," he said. "I think I've known it for a while. I haven't said it because I didn't know." He stopped, started again. "I wasn't sure you'd want to know." The kitchen was so quiet. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 18 years old and an auction platform and one bag and the determined intention to feel as little as possible. She thought about bread on Tuesdays and notes under a table and a foal named November and a coat with a name stitched in the collar and a man in a hallway at 2 a.m. who had finally, after 3 years of going carefully alone, said the thing that was true. "I love you too," she said. "I think I've known it for almost as long as you have." He looked at her. Something in him went very still in the way that things went still when they had finally arrived somewhere they'd been traveling toward without being sure they'd get there. "What do we do with that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I think," Elena said, "we decide what we want, and then we do that." From the front hallway, entirely without warning, came the sound of Clara's voice. "Owen." A pause. "Owen, come here." And then Owen. "What?" "They said it," Clara said, with the particular quiet intensity that she brought to things she considered significant. A very brief silence. "Finally," Owen said. And then, clearly and without any attempt at subtlety, the sound of 2 6-year-olds walking away from the hallway with the specific lightness of people who have just received news they have been waiting for and are very satisfied with the result. Mercer looked at the door, then at Elena. Something moved across his face. The full smile again, real and unguarded and entirely his. And she looked at it and thought, there it is. There is the person who was in here all along. "They were listening," he said. "They're always listening," Elena said. And for the first time in a very long time, she laughed. The laughter was the thing that stayed with her afterward, not the words themselves, though the words mattered. The words were the realest thing that had happened in that kitchen since she arrived, but the laughter, which had come out of her without permission, surprised out of existence by 2 6-year-olds walking away from a hallway with the satisfied air of people whose long-held position had finally been vindicated by events. She hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could accurately remember. The kind that came from somewhere below strategy, below self-protection, below all the careful management of how much of yourself you let into the open air. Mercer had watched her laugh, and his own expression had stayed on that unguarded smile for longer than usual, like he was in no hurry to put the careful surface back, like maybe he was reconsidering whether he needed it so much in this particular kitchen with this particular person. They had not kissed that evening. They had not made any formal declaration beyond the words already said. What they had done was sit at the kitchen table for another hour with the coal field notes between them and talked. Really talked. Not the careful exchange of necessary information they had refined over months, but the kind of conversation that happens when two people have finally stopped managing the distance between them and don't quite know what to do with the new proximity, except fill it with words and find out what the other person sounds like when they're not being careful. She learned that he had come west at 22, with enough money to buy land and no clear plan beyond the conviction that open space was what he needed, and that open space was what the territory had in abundance. She told him about her mother more than she'd told Clara on the back step. The specific things, the way she'd hummed while she worked, and the particular smell of the bread she made, and the way she'd held her opinions about people to herself until she'd had enough evidence to form them properly, and then held them without apology. "That's where you get it," he said. "Get what?" "The waiting," he said. "You watch for a long time before you decide what you think about something." Elena considered this. "I thought I was being cautious." "You are," he said, "but it's a particular kind of cautious. You're not afraid to decide, you're just thorough first." She looked at him. "You notice that." "I notice things about you," he said simply. Not as a declaration, just as a fact he was reporting. She had gone to bed that night with the particular kind of full feeling that has nothing to do with food, the feeling of a day that had contained more real things than usual, that had moved something forward that needed moving, that had made the shape of the future slightly more legible than it had been that morning. She lay in the dark and thought, I'm going to have to figure out what I actually want, not what's practical, not what makes sense given the circumstances, what I want. She had spent so many years making decisions based on what was available rather than what was desired that the question felt almost foreign, like a language she'd known as a child and let go unpracticed. She fell asleep working on it. The land office sent its formal response on a Tuesday, which Owen noted with the satisfaction of a boy who believed Tuesdays were inherently significant. The complaint filed by O. Dunst and Associates had been reviewed in light of the original survey documentation, the coal field notes, and the formal response prepared by Alden Marsh. The complaint was dismissed. The northern boundary of the Mercer property was confirmed as established in the 1871 survey. The file was closed. Mercer read the letter at the kitchen table with Marsh's accompanying note, which said simply, as expected, bill enclosed. Good outcome. Elena read it after him. Neither of them said much because the thing had been so thoroughly worked through in the preceding weeks that the formal resolution felt less like a victory than like the closing of a door that had been banging in the wind for a month. A relief, mostly, the particular quiet that follows the end of a sustained tension. What they hadn't anticipated was Dunst himself. He appeared at the ranch 2 days after the letter, which was either very bold or very stupid, and Elena suspected it was neither. She suspected it was calculated, a final move in a game he was not quite willing to concede publicly. He came alone, which was also calculated, because a man alone at another man's door was a social call, and a social call was harder to refuse than a confrontation. Mercer saw him from the barn and came across the yard with the particular economy of movement that Elena had learned meant he was managing something in himself. She was at the kitchen window and watched the two men meet in the yard. She could not hear the exchange clearly from inside, but she could read the body language. Dunst doing most of the talking, expansive, hands moving in the gestures of someone making a reasonable case. Mercer listening with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he had already decided the outcome and was waiting for the other person to finish. She went outside. She didn't plan to. She was in the middle of something in the kitchen, and she set it down and went outside because something in the way the conversation was arranged, Dunst angled toward Mercer, his back to the house, presenting his case to the man and away from the witness, felt wrong, in the way things feel wrong when you've spent enough time learning how a particular kind of person operates. Dunst turned when he heard her behind him. His expression shifted through several things quickly. Surprise, assessment, recalculation, before settling into something cordial. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Mr. Dunst," she said. She came to stand beside Mercer, close enough that the alignment was clear. "I was just explaining to Silas," Dunst said in the tone of a man who used first names as a tool, "that the land office decision is of course final, and I have no quarrel with it. The survey question was a legitimate point of inquiry. These things need to be checked." "Of course," Elena said. "No hard feelings," Dunst said. He was looking at her now more than at Mercer, which was its own kind of statement. "I understand there may have been some ill will following the auction in November. I want to be clear that I bear no such feeling toward either of you." "That's very generous," Elena said. Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. She had not been aggressive or sarcastic. She had been entirely measured, but she was not performing warmth, and he was the kind of man who expected warmth to be performed, expected the social contract to smooth over things the way it usually did, and her refusal to provide it was a refusal he couldn't quite name or address directly. "I hope we can be neighbors without difficulty," he said, shifting back to Mercer. Mercer said, "We've always managed before." There was a pause. Dunst seemed to be considering whether there was anything more to extract from this conversation and deciding there wasn't. He looked once more at Elena with the expression of a man filing information away, then nodded to Mercer and walked back to his horse. They watched him ride out. The January air was cold and clean, and the horse's breath made small clouds as it moved. "What was he actually here for?" Elena asked. "To look at you," Mercer said. She glanced at him. "He wanted to see if the situation here was what he thought it was," Mercer said. "Whether you'd come outside, whether you'd stand there." He paused. He got his answer. "And now he knows the shape of things," Elena said. "Now he knows the shape of things," Mercer agreed, "which means he'll leave it alone. Men like Dunst don't fight what they can't win. They move on to the next opportunity." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been looking at him across various tables for years. He's not new to me." Mercer looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked back at him. "Then, yes," she said. "I'm all right." They stood in the yard for another moment in the cold air and then went back inside, and that was the last time Orville Dunst came to the Mercer ranch. It was Owen who brought it up first, which was not surprising, because Owen had been the child least willing to wait for things to develop at their own pace when he'd decided on an outcome. He raised it at supper on a Friday in late January, in the direct way he'd inherited from his father, except without his father's discipline about timing, which meant it arrived without preamble in the middle of a conversation about the foal's growth rate. "Are you going to get married?" he said. The table went quiet. Clara looked at her plate with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had made her peace with it. Mercer set down his fork. He looked at Owen with the particular look he used when Owen had done something that required addressing, but that Mercer also privately found understandable. "Owen," he said. "I'm asking because I want to know," Owen said. "Clara wants to know too. She just wasn't going to ask." "That's because some things are private," Clara said without looking up. "They're not private if they affect all of us," Owen said. Elena looked at Mercer. He looked at her. There was a quality to the look, a mutual acknowledgement of the situation's particular character, two adults at a kitchen table being thoroughly managed by a 6-year-old. "It's a fair question," Elena said. Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Owen. "We haven't discussed it yet," he said. "Adults need to have conversations before they make decisions." "You said you loved each other," Owen said. "In the kitchen, Clara and I heard." "Owen," Clara said. "It's true," Owen said. "We did hear it." "I know we heard it," Clara said. "I'm saying you don't have to say it at supper." "Why not?" "Because," Clara stopped, appeared to assess her actual reasoning. "I don't know. It seems like the kind of thing you say privately." "They said it privately," Owen said. "In the kitchen. We heard it privately from the hallway." Elena put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Mercer was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man choosing between several responses. "All right," he said finally. He looked at both children. "We haven't made any decisions yet because these things take consideration. When we have something to tell you, we'll tell you." Owen considered whether this was sufficient. "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone granting a reasonable extension. "But not too long. Claire's been thinking about it so much she talked in her sleep about it." "I did not," Clara said. "You said the wedding in your sleep on Tuesday," Owen said. "I heard you through the wall." Clara appeared to be sincerely mortified. She looked at her plate with the intensity of someone who was considering whether she could exit the conversation by sheer concentration. Elena made the mistake of looking at Mercer at exactly the wrong moment. He was looking at her with the full smile, the real one, the one that changed his face. And she felt the laughter coming before she could stop it, and it came out quiet this time, controlled, but real. And across the table, Owen looked pleased with himself, and Clara looked pained, and the kitchen held all of them in the particular warmth of a family at supper that was, whatever else it was, and whatever it was still becoming, unmistakably real. He asked her on a Sunday morning in February, not with ceremony, not with staging, not in any way that bore resemblance to the formal conventions that attached to such things. He came into the kitchen before the rest of the house was up, which was rare enough that she knew immediately something was different, and he stood at the end of the counter with his coffee and looked at her for a moment. "I've been thinking about what Owen asked," he said. Elena was at the stove. She did not stop what she was doing. "So have I," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not because it's required, because you've spent enough of your life being handled and decided for, and I want to—" He stopped, started again with the care he gave to things that mattered. "I want this to be something you chose, completely, with no practical pressure around it." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a performance, just the question, said directly, held out to her the way he held everything, without decoration, without anything extra, just the thing itself. She had been thinking about what she wanted for weeks, about the question she'd posed to herself on the night the words first got said in the kitchen. She had her answer. "Yes," she said. He put down his coffee. He crossed the kitchen and he took her face in both hands. Those steady hands, the watchmaker's hands, the hands that were better at stitching than hers. And he kissed her, and she let herself be completely present in it, without managing it or standing outside it watching herself from a careful distance. When they separated, he kept his hands where they were for a moment, looking at her, and she looked back, and neither of them needed to fill the moment with anything else. "Owen's going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Yes," he said. "He'll want to tell everyone in the territory." "Also, yes? We should tell them before breakfast so he doesn't spend the whole meal ready to explode." Mercer dropped his hands. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man thinking about the logistics of managing Owen's particular form of enthusiasm. "All right," he said. They went to the children's rooms. Owen was already awake, lying in bed with his eyes open in the way he did when he'd been thinking for a while before deciding to get up. He looked at them in the doorway with the assessing look. Then he looked at his father's face, and his own face did something complicated and young and real. "You asked her," he said. "Yes," Mercer said. Owen looked at Elena. "You said yes." "I said yes," Elena said. Owen sat up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there in his bed looking at both of them, and his face had the quality it had in the barn with November. The one without any performance in it. Just the feeling itself, too large to contain, too real to manage. "Okay," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Good." He looked away toward the window. "Good." Clara's response was different. She was still in bed when they came to her doorway, sitting up with her hair loose and her knees pulled to her chest. She looked at them both for a long moment with the measuring look. Then she looked at Elena specifically. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure," Elena said. Clara looked at her for another moment with those dark eyes that saw too much. Then she got up out of bed and crossed the room and put her arms around Elena, who received it with both her own arms and held her and felt the small, solid warmth of this child who had written, "You can call me yours if you want," on a piece of paper and left it under a table corner. Over Clara's shoulder, Elena looked at Mercer, and he looked at her, and she thought, this is what you build when you stop trying to avoid loss and start choosing what you want to be true instead. The wedding was in March, when the worst of the winter had broken and the light had started to carry warmth again in the middle hours of the day. They had not planned a large event. The territory did not require it, and neither of them had any particular inclination toward it. But the territory had its own ideas, and Patterson had apparently mentioned the date to Cody, who mentioned it to the supply rider, who mentioned it to someone in town. And by the time the Sunday arrived, there were 30 people in the yard of the Mercer Ranch. Neighbors, ranch hands from neighboring spreads, a few faces from Dunmore, Margaret dressed in her best coat with her hair done carefully and her bad hands wrapped in the good wool gloves she reserved for occasions. Alden Marsh had offered to conduct the ceremony, having some legal authority in territorial matters, and stood at the front of the assembled gathering with the efficient competence he brought to everything. The sky was pale blue and enormous above them all. Elena had not spent much thought on what to wear and had settled on a dress she'd made herself over the winter. Dark green wool, nothing elaborate, fitted well and finished well because she was good with her hands when she took the time. She had braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, down her back, tight and smooth. She walked out of the house and across the yard, and the people who had gathered made room, and she walked toward Silas Mercer, who was standing at the front with the look on his face she had come to understand meant he was feeling something large and was not trying to hide it. She reached him, and he took her hand, and she looked at him directly, which was the way she did everything. The ceremony was brief and real. They said what needed to be said without embellishment. When Marsh asked if anyone present had cause to object, Owen said, in a carrying voice from the front of the gathered crowd, "No, we've been waiting for this forever," which got a laugh from 30 people and a look from his father that Owen received with the composure of a person confident in the righteousness of his position. When it was done and the question had been asked and answered, Mercer kissed her in front of all of them, and she heard, from somewhere in the crowd, from the direction of 2 6-year-olds standing with Margaret, the sound of Clara saying something quiet and Owen saying something loud in return, and she did not catch the words, but she heard the tone, and the tone was the sound of children who had decided the world had finally arranged itself correctly. The reception was the yard and the barn, and whatever food 30 people could produce between them, which turned out to be considerable. Someone had brought 2 fiddles. The afternoon went on longer than anyone planned because no one was in a hurry to leave. Margaret found Elena near the barn door in the middle of the afternoon, away from the main noise for a moment. She stood beside her and looked out at the yard where Mercer was talking with 2 neighboring ranchers, and the children were involved in something competitive with Cody that seemed to require a great deal of running. 7 years ago when Eleanor died, Margaret said, not looking at Elena, I stayed because the children needed someone to stay. I told myself that's what it was. She paused. But I think I also stayed because I thought this house had something in it worth staying for, even when it wasn't easy to see. Elena watched Owen cross the yard at a run, cut left, lose to Cody anyway, and immediately demand a rematch. I think you were right, Elena said. I know I was right, Margaret said, but it's better now than I thought it could be. She paused again. She would have liked you, Eleanor. She would have argued with you about 3 things before lunch and respected you completely by supper. Elena looked at the older woman. What 3 things? The way you order the pantry, Margaret said. She had strong views about pantry organization. And the bread, she had a different technique, and probably something about the accounts because she liked doing them herself. She looked at Elena sideways. She was not easy, but she was honest and she was capable and she loved this place and these people without reservation. A beat. You're not the same as her, but the important parts match. Elena held this. The afternoon sun moved in the yard. Mercer had seen her across the space and glanced over with the look that was becoming familiar, the one that said, I see you without being performed for anyone else. Thank you, Elena said to Margaret, "for staying when you did, both for them and for—" She paused. "The situation I walked into would have been much harder without you." "You'd have managed," Margaret said. "Probably," Elena said. "Worse." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yes," she said. "Worse." She patted Elena's arm once, brief and certain, the way she did everything. "Go back to your party." Elena went back. The months that followed were not perfect, because nothing real is. There was a stretch in April when the cattle lost 2 calves to complications in a difficult week, and Mercer came inside both nights worn down to something short with everyone, including Elena, and she gave him room on the first night, and on the second night said, plainly, that she understood he was exhausted, and that didn't change that he'd been short with Owen at supper, and Owen had noticed and gone quiet. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been caught being less than their best self and knew it. He went and talked to Owen. She heard them in Owen's room for a while, voices low, and when Mercer came back out, he looked like something had eased in him. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just don't do it again." "I'll do it again," he said. "I'm not always—" He stopped. "I get inside my own head." "I know," she said. "And then I'll say something again. That's how it works." He looked at her with the expression she had decided was the one she liked best on him. Not the smile, though she loved that too, but the one that meant he was fully present and seeing her fully, and neither of them was managing the distance anymore. There was a fight in June about the summer grazing rotation that was not actually about the grazing rotation, and both of them knew it, but neither of them said so until the third day when Elena said, "We should say what this is actually about." And they did, which was harder and more uncomfortable than the argument about grazing rotation had been, but was over faster and left nothing unresolved in the walls between them. There was a morning in July when Clara woke up crying from a dream and would not say what the dream was, only that she had dreamed about her mother's voice and woken up before she could hear what it said. Elena sat with her for an hour in the gray early morning and did not try to fix it or redirect it or say anything that would suggest it was a problem to be solved. She just sat with her in the particular way of someone who understood that some grief was not going anywhere, and the most honest thing you could offer was company in it. Clara said eventually, "Do you think she knows? Where she is? That we're okay?" Elena said, "I don't know where she is or what she knows, but I think the love she had for you didn't go anywhere. I think that stays." Clara sat with this. Then she said, "Elena, can I call you Mama?" The morning was very still. "You can call me whatever you want to call me," Elena said. "Clara? I think I want to call you Mama," Clara said. "But not like I'm forgetting her, like I'm also having you." "That's exactly what it is," Elena said. "That's exactly right." Clara curled against her side and went back to sleep. Elena sat in the gray light and held her and thought about the particular arithmetic of love. How it did not divide when it extended to new people, how it accumulated instead, layer over layer, how a child could hold a mother she barely remembered, and a mother who was here right now, and neither would diminish the other, because that was not how the heart worked, no matter what people said. Owen asked, 2 weeks later, if he could call her Mama too. He asked it in the barn with November as witness, which was where Owen had his most honest conversations. He asked it looking at the ground, and then quickly at her face, and then at the ground again. "Yes," Elena said. "I asked Clara first," Owen said, "if it was okay. She said it was her idea and you'd said yes." "She's right." "She's going to be smug about it," Owen said. "Probably," Elena said. He nodded. He looked at November for a moment with the focused expression he used when something mattered too much for his face to hold it neutrally. "Okay," he said. "Good." He busied himself with the brush. "She's getting big." "She is," Elena said. "Patterson says she'll be ready to ride by spring." "He knows horses." "I'm going to train her myself," Owen said. "Patterson will help, but I'm going to do most of it." "I know you will," Elena said. He brushed in silence for a moment, then, "Mama." She stopped. He was not looking at her. He was looking at November with the look of a boy who had said a word out loud for the first time in 3 years and needed a moment to hear how it sounded in the air of a real place. "Yeah?" Elena said. Steady. Just that. "Nothing," he said. I just, he brushed the foal's flank. I just wanted to see. She understood. She let it be exactly what it was. Marsh sent a note in August. The land office had formally closed the Dunst boundary complaint with a notation in the public record confirming the Mercer survey. Dunst, Marsh had heard from a colleague in the Southern Territory, had moved his attention to a land acquisition near the river counties and was unlikely to revisit anything north of Dunmore. Elena read the note at the kitchen table and set it down and thought, "That's finished then." She looked around the kitchen, the counter where she'd first learned the bread technique from Owen, the table where Clara's notes had accumulated under the corner, the window that showed the yard and the barn, and past it, the open land running to the horizon. The pantry she and Margaret had reorganized 3 times before they agreed on a system. The stove that needed the damper adjusted a specific way, or it ran too hot on the left side. She had been here 10 months. It felt like something much longer than that, and also, in some moments, like something she was still just arriving into, still discovering the edges of. Mercer came in from outside and saw the note on the table. He read it. He set it back down. He went to get his coffee and stood at the window looking out at the yard where November was visible in the corral, growing into herself in the ungainly way of young horses. "Done," he said. "Done," Elena said. He looked at her. "Are you thinking about something?" "Several things," she said, "the way I usually am." "Which several things?" She looked at him, at this man she had married in March, in the yard of his ranch with 30 people watching. This man who had outbid a cruel stranger at an auction for reasons he had eventually admitted were complicated. This man who was better at stitching than she was, and who talked to his children when they were sick in ways he'd never talked to them when they were well. This man who was not easy and not perfect, and who went inside his own head when the hard weeks came and needed to be told when he'd been short with someone and took the correction without resentment. "I was thinking about the platform," she said, "in Dunmore. The auction." He turned from the window. His face was attentive in the full way. "I used to think about it as the worst day of my life," she said, "the most powerless, and in a lot of ways it was." She paused. "But I've been rethinking that. Not in the—" She stopped, found the right framing. "Not in the way of saying it was fine or good or meant to be. It wasn't any of those things. It was a thing that should not have been allowed to happen to anyone." She met his eyes. "But it happened. And what came after it, what I found after it, was not in spite of where I was. It was partly because of where I ended up." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "I used to feel like I'd done something that needed answering for," he said, "buying the contract." "I know. I don't entirely anymore," he said. "Not because what I did was right, because what we've made of it is something other than what it was." She nodded. "That's what I mean." The thing she had come to understand, over 10 months of hard work and difficult nights and ordinary mornings that turned out to be the most valuable part, the thing she had worked out slowly and imperfectly, the way she worked out everything, was this: that dignity was not something that got granted to you by circumstance. You could have it stripped away by people with power and money and bad intentions, and you could still carry it in you, could still refuse to let it be taken completely, and could build it back in the actual materials of your actual life. Not as performance, not as defiance, just as the slow accumulation of honest work and honest feeling, and the choice, made over and over in small ways, to keep showing up as yourself. She had been sold. That had happened. It had been done to her, and it had been wrong, and no version of what came after erased it. But she had also chosen to climb down from the wagon instead of staying in the back, to ask him what she should know before she agreed, to answer Owen's question about leaving with the truth instead of the easy comfort, to stand at the kitchen window when the fever broke and admit, without running from it, that she had a stake in this place and these people that went past any contract. The choices were hers, even when almost nothing else had been. That was not a small thing. Mercer set down his coffee and crossed the kitchen, and she stood up, and they stood together at the table with the August light coming through the window and the yard visible beyond the glass, the whole working world of the ranch going on in its ordinary way. the ranch hands doing whatever the afternoon required. Owen's voice somewhere in the direction of the barn, Clara probably in her room writing something she would leave under the table later. "I want to do something," Mercer said. "What?" "I want to take you to Dunmore," he said. "Not for any specific reason, just—" He paused. "Just to walk down the main street with you, together." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying. Not performance. He was not a man for performance, just the fact of it. Just being there, together, visible. In the place where the auction had been, where Harlan Greer had grabbed her chin and the crowd had put numbers on her future. "All right," she said. "Saturday." He nodded. He went back to his work, and she went back to hers, and the afternoon moved forward in the way of good afternoons in August, unhurried, full of light, the work familiar and the house around her as real as the weight of her own two hands. Mom. They went on Saturday. Owen and Clara came because Owen had declared immediately that he was coming, and Clara had said she was coming because Owen would make a mess of it otherwise, which was not her real reason, but was Clara's way of protecting her real reason from examination. They walked down the main street of Dunmore on a Saturday in August. The four of them, Mercer with his hand at Elena's back, the children ranging ahead and coming back and ranging ahead again, in the way of children who have somewhere to go but can't quite commit to the pace. People nodded. A few people stopped to speak. The woman who ran the dry goods store came out specifically to congratulate them on the marriage, which she had heard about through the territory's efficient informal networks, and she shook Elena's hand and said, "I heard you kept that Dunst business from getting worse," in a tone that said she knew exactly what Dunst was and had her own opinions about it. They walked past the auction platform. It was just wood, just a raised structure of boards, weathered and ordinary, sitting at the edge of the street doing nothing in particular on a Saturday afternoon. Elena looked at it as she passed. She did not stop. She did not give it more than a glance, but she noticed that Mercer's hand at her back pressed slightly as they passed it, and she noticed that Owen, who had run ahead, circled back at exactly that moment and walked on her other side for a half a block before ranging forward again. She didn't know if Owen had done it deliberately. She didn't ask. Some things were said without words in this family, and those things were often the most honest ones. They had lunch at the Dunmore Hotel restaurant, which Owen found impressively formal, and Clara found interesting from a structural standpoint, examining the table settings with the focused attention she brought to anything unfamiliar. They ate well and talked about small things. November's progress, a book Clara was reading, whether the summer had been too dry for the fall grazing, and the conversation was completely ordinary and completely real, and Elena sat in the middle of it thinking, this is what I fought for, this right here. Not the dramatic moments, though those had been real too. This, the ordinary Saturday in August with the people who were hers and the food on the table and nothing required of her except to be present in it. She was present in it. On the drive home, Clara fell asleep against Elena's arm. Owen lasted 20 minutes longer before he went too, slumped against the side of the wagon with his mouth slightly open in the way that would have embarrassed him enormously if he'd known. Mercer drove. The land opened out around them in the long gold light of late afternoon, the grass dry and moving in the wind, the sky doing the thing it did over open territory. Becoming enormous, becoming the main fact of the world. Elena looked at it and thought about a girl who had stood on a platform and tried to find something to fix her eyes on, and had found two cottonwood trees at the end of the street where the branches had grown so close together they had started to tangle into each other, and couldn't tell anymore where one ended and the other began. She had not been able to see those trees today, with the lunch crowd on the street, but she knew they were there. She knew what they looked like. She leaned her head slightly against Mercer's shoulder and felt Clara's warm weight against her arm, and heard Owen breathe in his unguarded sleep. The ranch appeared on the horizon in the way it always did. First a suggestion, then a shape, then itself, fully and particularly itself, coming into view the way things came into view when you were driving home. She had not had that before. A thing to drive toward. She had it now.